Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Please follow or subscribe to this podcast. It helps me keep this endeavor going and also helps me to reach more and more people with these vital conversations. Part of the challenge of exploring all these types of anomalous phenomenon, from UFOs and sundry to all the strange and visionary types of unexplained experiences people throughout the ages have described in great detail, is merely thinking outside conventional boxes. And yes, even these challenging realms we've entered together over the past year and a half have their own boxes, the typical and sometimes tired ways people consider them and explain them, turning them over and over again into digestible bits that remain compatible with their worldviews, whatever those may be. But maybe at least part of the truth remains exotic, at least by the standards found on internet forums and X-chats. Could the root of much of what we entertain in these conversations be something different than what we've all most commonly considered? Our guest today, who goes by the pen name Seth Peribsen, has long been formulating such a theory, an approach to the phenomenology of non-human intelligences and high strangeness that exits the tired boxes of old and reconsiders much of what we discuss on Neon Galactic from an entirely new direction. His approach has been winning converts, and as we'll soon see, he has a mountain of data and science to back himself up. He also offers a method by which he believes folks can free themselves from the tyranny of a terrible yet ubiquitous alien invader, one found commonly in the environment, on our plates, and even in our brains. This will be a wild ride through the sciences, through ancient myth and culture, through the human body, and into a fresh consideration of how the universe and some of its tiniest denizens may well be using us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. So I'd like to start explaining a little bit of my overall theory. So I have some concerns that I've outlined a bit on different forums and so on that revolve around a change that you can pick up on with a set of diseases that seem to have come in quickly and then started affecting the populace at large. And this is going back, 22,000 years ago or so. A lot of my theory revolves around a spot called Tafferault, where we, being Homo sapiens and some other offshoots of humanity's variations, were kind of pooled up, say 150, 120,000 years ago. The site started being really heavily used. It's basically a cave system, a set of caves where we inhabited, dumped things a lot. There were a lot of funerary things happening. And there was a dramatic shift in the environment. And that was, like I say, around that 18,000 year mark. And the sea level rose very quickly. And when that happened, whatever was in this dumping ground and area that we were hanging out as early humans, and this is, again, this is kind of one of many sites I see as, a potential cradle of humanity kind of deal. But that sea level rise introduced us to some things that really hit our systems hard. A lot of times you'll hear of it as, onset of when tooth decay first shows up in a population. A lot of theories have hammered that home pretty well, where it's usually targeted towards intake of carbohydrates, changes in our diet, we're going from hunter-gatherer to sedentary and taking, it's usually something that's 8,000, 9,000 years ago, roughly, is where that usually shows up in those theories. But if you look further back at the site Tafferault I'm referring to,
you think it started there? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and it is actually out there. Max Planck Institute has some studies around this where they had found all of a sudden all the teeth were showing eruptions in the populace at this Tafferault site, but it was like 10,000 or so years before we had originally thought it started occurring. So my take is, because of the way these diseases we're going to talk about work, that introduction, our immune systems really weren't ready for it, got chipped away very quickly because these pathogens can do that. They'll just slip the immune system and start a bunch of issues, and then they're at us. So now that kind of spread out, and you'll see variations of this disease set we're referring to that show in different populations, and it kind of echoes or mimics these migration routes out of that Tafferault region in Morocco that I'm referring to. There's a couple of sites, actually one that even goes back further than that, around 300,000 years ago, with some crossovers with Neanderthal and human. So that's something that is really a key to this, is that crossing. It looks like a lot of that may have contributed some predisposition potentials with that Neanderthal crossover and some of the things that changed in our own genome because of these damages. So now you will see certain disease sets. Apesit is one that comes up a lot in my world, and that's a predisposition to fungal diseases. So basically yeast, and I should clarify too right up front, a lot of people when I say fungal issues or fungal diseases, they immediately jump to like toadstools and
Yeah.
thinking
I mean,
about regular mushrooms and so on, right?
that's the topic of the day. People are really, thinking about mushrooms right now because of the psychedelic movement and all of that.
Right,
But that's
exactly.
not what you mean. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's not. It's, they're still technically fungi, but they're a very different bracket, behavior-wise, structure-wise. They get some similarities, but they're definitely doing their own thing compared to like a mycelial growth that might be under a tree bed or something like that.
Yeah.
So these are what would be called the dimorphic yeast. So they can
Mhm.
kind of change their form from what people think of the mother cell with a daughter cell budding off and then becoming its own thing and going along its way. In the case that I study, they will shift to mycelial form from that yeast form. So instead of popping the daughter cell off, they turn that into a little extended membrane that's kind of a straight line for the most part, and that'll connect to other cells that have already developed that straight piece of it's a hyphae is what it's called. And those hyphae will connect, then they break down the wall in between them, and now you've got a kind of a collective organism from these
Yeah.
single organisms. And they do start biofilm generations in the body. They'll use these networks they have to transfer multiple nuclei, mitochondria, all that stuff around their internals, technically.
Yeah.
And then that kind of forces that invasion or that infection to go further out into the body and take over more resources and so on.
Yeah. So it slowly begins to grow and doing more and more damage, right? I mean,
Yeah, it almost becomes like I say, a cooperative organism of sorts. And you can even find that with other microbes you might not think would do this. And I'm talking, viruses and some bacteria actually partner with these particular fungi that are invasive to humans, and they'll make like a co-organism, a co-biofilm, where
mhm.
they're just handing stuff back and forth,
Now
and
the
we don't have
biofilm
access to it. Yes, sir.
The biofilm is integral because it allows for a layer of protection for the organism itself, right? It's like it's the way that it's like its fortifications inside the body so that it prevents your immune system from having any efficacy in fighting it. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, and it
Yeah.
almost takes on like an amoebic quality.
Hmm.
And we all know that's kind of an issue with when amoeba invade the human body. You have a lot of stories out there where people go swimming and come back with something that's happened and they inhaled something errantly and then it sets up shop and does some real damage. When they get in this biofilm and hyphenated form, this mycelial form, they're technically, and the reference is yeast in mold in a tube or amoeba
Hmm.
in a tube is what you'll hear.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that whole protective idea. It's like it's hard for a body to break down the outside of those biofilms. If it can break those down, then the actual membrane on the cells themselves is also resistant to a lot of our attacks and being detected. They do that with different lipopolysaccharides and other types of lipids and whatnot that we really don't have a way to degrade in the body usually. So
Yeah.
it takes some mechanical action and some chemical action to be able to get that out of there.
So now, just for the viewers to give a little bit of an overview before we get into the granular stuff, because this you have done your research, it's impressive, and we're going to go through a lot of that. But so what you're positing basically that we have been colonized by funguses, right?
Yeah.
And that they have a lot of the things that we're experiencing as an NHI may in fact be these funguses. Is that a good way to put it, or how would you
Yeah, I
state
would
it?
I would say like an NHI set would be
Okay.
applicable
Yes.
here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Okay.
at the base definition, you can kind of see that reflected in other studies of fungi. So you look at like some of those large mycelial growths that are under the tree, the forest out west. And I say out west, I mean out in Pacific Northwest. They have an organism that they've tracked for quite some time that has some form of communication amongst its own network. It does have, a semblance of consciousness, and that's why I'm saying, non-human intelligence doesn't necessarily mean a gray from Alpha Centauri or wherever it might be for these other facets of the phenomenon. But in this instance, there is something that I would consider a non-human or potentially a non-human intelligence inside the body
Yeah.
via these networks. So,
Yeah.
and you can also take that direction with some of the slime mold work that they have done,
Hmm.
which we'll touch on a little bit, but they have these experiments they run where they will set up a slime mold and give resources out there on a map, like a subway map. Japan's the famous one for this. They made this copy of their subway map that they had worked decades on to get it more and more refined and more efficient. And they put this slime mold on this map with the resources, little pieces of food everywhere, and it mapped its own most efficient route. And Japan changed their subway routes to match what this slime mold had come up with, and it did actually make it more efficient for the country.
That's insane.
So, and this is very similar now. Now, the big thing that people get stuck on when they think about, and I'm going back to something I said a moment ago, these hyphenated networks where the septa breaks down in between those membranes, and then it's just transferring all the chemistry, all the charge, all the communication back and forth.
Mhm.
Those are actually something that would mimic that idea of the amoeba or slime mold side of the kingdoms, where a slime mold is kind of extending a less rigid membrane, but it's doing the
Mhm.
same thing. It's a single membrane with many nuclei inside, and that's the
Yeah.
same with an amoeba. It's a similar deal. And I did actually, we'll talk about this later too, but there's a study that happened pretty recently where they actually broke down this membrane
Mhm.
on some yeast, and they acted exactly like an amoeba or slime mold. So
Yeah.
they were able to just extend that membrane without having to go to that rigid hyphenated form like most of these inside the human body. There are some really uncomfortable keys as well to the way they interact with our biology. So one that I go over a lot because it throws a flag for most people is when they invade the body. And bear in mind, you do not have to be immune compromised to have these be able to set up shop. And I have some
Yeah.
examples of this I want to share with you later. But they will just pass the immune barrier and start going. So
Mhm.
when this happens, you can look at the way that the system's reacted. So our immune system has reacted a certain way, and they get in there and set up shop, and they start doing these damages at about 95 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
Candida albicans, which everyone kind of knows that one off the top of their head. You hear a lot of Candida talk out there in the health world these days. That one is one of the ones that's specifically set to trigger that change from the yeast form to the hyphal form, and that's at 95 Fahrenheit. As soon
Yeah.
as that hits, it's a one-to-one, so it's a cell to cell. So their cell to our one epithelial cell, it'll invade that cell and start doing a bunch of manipulations via different chemistries, usually lysine, like a cytolysine, and then that starts all the damage. And it's kind of doing a lot of things with our resources that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
And when I say this, I'm talking about like calcium control in the cell is a big deal. So a lot of disease is related to how that calcium, especially serum calcium, is showing for levels. This is actually tapping right into our mitochondria, our membrane through the epithelial to the mitochondrial membrane using these little, I would call it pore building
Mhm.
process with this lysine that it makes, this toxin that it makes. It drills a little pore, and then next thing you know, there's just you know nuclear and mitochondrial stuff just coming out of the cell membranes that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So
And so their end goal there is to basically make it, I mean, well, we don't know what the end goal is, but I mean, they're making it more hospitable for themselves. And all of that work is having some sort of effect on us as an organism. And what that cumulative impact is, we have no idea at this point, right? I mean, like,
right,
I mean,
yeah,
there you have some ideas, but I mean, we don't know the effect to which this may be impacting, influencing, controlling us in various ways. And it's not just, like parts of the body that aren't executive. This gets into your brain and can affect neurons, right? So it's
correct,
something
yeah,
that's hugely broad based and could potentially be having a major impact on humanity.
that's correct. Yeah, you can see a lot of just on the surface, just on the medical end, you can see a lot of cognitive issues that play back to these species. There's three major genera that I focus on really, which would be Candida. There's
Mhm.
a few species that are real problematic for humans. I mean, they all kind of are, but there's ones that are more tuned to being opportunistic. Um, Aspergillus, so that genera is another one, and then we've got Cryptococcus, which is our favorite. We'll be spending a lot of time on that one today. So the Cryptococcus stuff is the one that would really be a focus if we're looking at cognitive changes and potential. I'll just drop this now, like a control system aspect to these,
Yeah.
and it does look like that's there. As to why, like you're saying, who knows the back end, but you can
Yeah.
see the number work on the medical data is there to support this, and you start looking deeper and deeper into some of the stories that we're going to go over, and you can see there's something that's there for knowledge that we lost along the way, is my take on that.
Yeah. Fascinating. So, if you want, we'll start going through the points that we've laid out prior, if you don't mind. You
Sure.
mentioned Taffarel and the fact that it started there, and that was sort of the emergence of this particular set of issues, and that there were some genetic changes that occurred out of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when that issue happened, and there's an image that I have shared with you.
So,
So you
yeah.
can see on this chart, you can see here that there's about a 400-foot rise, roughly, 400 feet over the course of a very short period of time. It's on the far right of the chart.
Mhm.
And that is where that detritus, would have been brought up from the depths of this area and the cave system and everything else, and we would have been exposed to that. And like most issues with post floods, you have a lot of disease that pops up. This one was
Yeah.
really strong. What my take is here is that the issue popped up. They kind of figured out, hey, we might not want to be around this, and you can see a bunch of migratory routes that started taking track away from that region of Taffrelt and out across the Levant up into Europe, Maghreb in general. All those migrations that happen, they go back to about 15, 16,000 years ago for the first records you can see. Taffrelt forward, and you can kind of track these things through the genetic lineages too. There's a bunch that relate to these fungal predispositions, and it's funny how much matches. There's the migrations out of Taffrelt, the people who did migrate out of that region to these other areas now are showing these same predispositions and these same damage potentials related to fungal infections. So they do have. Just going to check this note real quick here. So there are a couple analyses that they did, and I'm pulling one article up here. Bear with me for a moment, James.
Yeah, no worries, man.
So this one is actually the one that would note about 120,000 years ago is when we started doing all this hanging out in Taffarel.
Mhm.
So again, you've had about 80,000 years by the time that sea level
Is
rise happened.
Yeah, when the soup got stirred or whatever, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
yeah.
And it was everything. It was a lot of pigeon waste, bird waste because we were keeping pigeons there. It's actually Taffarel is like Grotto of Pigeons is the other name of that place.
Oh,
So we were keeping pigeons there. Pigeons are a known vector for both Candida albicans and Cryptococcus neoformans and Godi. So that's happening. So they're excreting these pathogens directly, and now the pathogens are sitting in this muck, and then the muck comes up, and here we go. Now, one of the things that you can see in the migratory routes, and this would be on image 2
okay. Let's go
of the
there. All
slides
right,
that we have.
got
So
it.
you can see the time frames match. You've got these spots to the left of the chart, the map
Hmm.
that's here. And if you look, that is matching on the right-hand panel, this little triangle up in the upper right corner that goes back to, you'd say roughly about, like I said, 16,000 years or so. And that's the initial point. And these
Okay.
groups start showing up in large swaths as you go along that migratory route, and the timeline from the right, you can see they start actually matching where we expect in general these groups landed. So, Iran is a big one, all the way up towards Scandinavian regions with the Sami is another one, a lot of Levant, uh, places just east of Egypt that are on this map. Those spots were all kind of starting to get settled after this big push, this migratory push, when I think, again, they realized, hey, we don't want to be in this spot
Yeah,
and we need to move along.
yeah.
So they did so. Some of the older sites you can find, let's say Egypt, for example, Siwa Oasis is a place I bring up a lot because it's one of the first you can find that was settled in Egypt, that's really clearly settled in Egypt. And it goes back to about 12,000 BC, if I remember off the
Okay.
top of my head. But there's a bunch of really intricate sites there. It was an oracle of sorts, so a lot of history with people going there. In fact, Alexander the Great, that was the oracle he went to get
Oh, okay.
information. Is the Oracle of Amun Ra is what that
Yeah,
was.
where he
Amun,
was. Yeah, okay. There's the documentary on, or the dramatic documentary on Netflix that covers his life has that whole journey prominently featured,
right.
which is
And
interesting.
actually, there's a secondary thing that happened. A lot of people don't know. When you go out and look up Siwa, there was a
Hmm.
dig that was supposed to have happened. I believe it was a Greek archaeologist that was doing this work, and he said, "Hey, I think this is where Alexander's tomb might be." And he said it out loud a little too much, and his own government of Greece intervened on that dig. at Siwa Oasis to try and figure out if that was Alexander's tomb or not. His own
Yeah.
government reached out to Egypt and they all just ixnayed the whole dig and everything else. So no one's gone back for that. So,
Wow.
but I think, it's something that once we get a chance to go back and start looking at these sites, these older sites again, we're going to find some history that matches up parts of what I'm saying here for these migratory routes going back
Yeah.
so far. Yeah.
Now, so people can just get a sense real quick on that graphic. The dots on the right are the same as the dots on the left. It's basically a key of what's displayed on the map. So it's a one-for-one match, right? Like the black triangle is the black triangle, and then going down. You see what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So that furthest right inverted triangle on the calibrated date section, that matches that little black triangle that's right near the Straits of Gibraltar there in
Yeah, yeah.
Morocco. Yeah, so that's
Perfect.
Taffrald itself. And then it
Okay.
moves forward. You can see it kind of march across, northeast Africa up into Europe and all those other areas you normally hear about. So there are other things there too, that are worth mentioning real quick before we move anything
Sure.
along for the timeline stuff. There's
Yeah.
they had some really confusing in that general region. They had some really confusing skeletons that showed up at one point, and that's something I want to spend some time on a little bit here too. But
Yeah, yeah.
on the quick mention, Neanderthals were kind of sharing space with us up until about 40,000 years ago in these areas. And if you go back from the 120,000 year mark to 300,000 years, there's another site where they found these skeletons that they were very confused by, especially before we figured out, gene sequencing and checking what was what. They're just going by archaeological record and previous record that they had to go by. They thought these were Neanderthal skeletons. And it turned out, no, they actually weren't. They were something that was very close to, but just close enough to Homo sapiens, they would be a human skeleton instead of Neanderthal. But it
Yeah.
was so far back, it was very confusing. And I think that some of these issues may actually be due to the mutations that come along with the Neanderthal related traits, especially
Mhm.
immune related things. And that's something that does show up a lot now. I know the hot topic for quite a while has been SARS-CoV-2. And
Mhm.
there's actually a specific predisposition that happens if you have higher Neanderthal percentages in your DNA that would make you more susceptible to that SARS-CoV-2 infection. And actually, now I'm thinking about this, that kind of ties in with the overall idea of those predispositions being carried forward, because when you look at the APSID disease set that I refer to a lot, that disease was in some of the top brackets for initial vaccination when the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines first started coming out. That was one of
Yeah.
the main groups. So you can see this all as kind of this big ball of issues with predispositions to disease. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of this is coming out of that area originally because of the exposures that happen all at once.
So a quick question with, I mean, some of these susceptibilities come, you're saying from the our mixing with Neanderthal. Are there predispositions that are constructed or brought into us by the funguses, or is that unrelated? I mean,
They are tied. Yeah, it is
okay.
related. If anything, I would say almost that the Neanderthal traits that are there, a lot of times you'll see certain mutations. MC1R is one that comes up a lot. So that's the melanocortin 1 receptor, which is why people that present my trait set would freckle and have lighter skin and blue eyes and so on. That's part of that mutation set that is kind of tied to a lot of the Neanderthal traits.
Okay.
And that relies on, I'm going to go science here for a minute with the guanine stuff. So in the
Please. Yeah. Yeah.
genome,
Hmm.
guanine is usually what you would see being damaged most by this range of pathogens. They go for the lowest rent lysing or lesioning of the genome, and that's guanine. It's a one electron exchange, and then that's lysed out. So now you have a mutation, a polymorphism that's happening there. And with that particular set of those, the guanine section around this MC1R trait set is kind of real integrated. So when you start looking at the damage that's happening from the fungi and how it relates to the higher guanine reliance of some of the MC1R traits, it is kind of matching right up. So they're damaging these things more readily, more easily, and then that kind of spread to the rest of the population. And now we're talking 20,000 years or so. So if
Yeah.
that did set in at Taffrald as I'm proposing, now you've had plenty of time for this to reach much, much further. You could see all the way to, say Japan. There's some mutations there that were passed along by Neanderthal traits, which would be OCA, the OCA2 gene. I believe is one of those or SLA is the other one. I have to double check that, but those genes, you can see that kind of stretched out around the globe to far extremes from Northeast Africa.
So,
And
real quick, I want
sure.
to point out a couple similarities here. I mean, people in the phenomenon often talk about genetic manipulation, and
Mhm.
there's an idea of what that means. But this would be genetic manipulation, and if the funguses are this form of NHI that you're positing, we've been genetically manipulated to be more susceptible to them in order that they can colonize us and use us as a successful breeding ground. And that fits in right in along with the data that we've been given through these, cryptic messages from folks like Lou Elizondo and whatnot. Another thing that he said is that when all this comes out, it's going to be like finding out that we have cancer. And to
That's
me,
a
that sort of it seems like it resonates a little bit. I mean, I don't know that all of this is true, but there are a lot of resonances that you have to seriously consider um, this thinking. I think it's fascinating, man. It really is.
Yeah, well, and actually, it's funny you bring us to that point because I want to jump off that for a little bit. So I started all this research really for the medical side.
Mhm.
So I want to explain that a little bit to where I landed
Yeah,
in phenomenon
yeah, please
in
do. Yeah, yeah.
phenomenology. So we had, and actually, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna start with right at the beginning of what I would consider where my eyes were opened to how bad these diseases can be.
Yeah, because this is
My
your personal experience. I mean, you have a personal experience with what this means and how it affects people. So go ahead.
Right, right.
Sorry.
So, I was born with a bunch of predisposition issues. I had some congenital deformities. So I had my legs were inverted; they were twisted, almost 180 degrees the other way. So that's one big presentation because of these. If it's in the womb, which is what happened with my side, and these do get in. A lot of people think that you can't bridge placental barrier and so on. There's actually studies out there now showing that there's a pretty high range of mycotoxins in the amniotic fluid itself, which of course, if it's in the amniotic fluid, it's next to the fetus, and there you go. So that's what happened in my case. So my
Yeah.
specific disease set would be like APS or APSID are the two terms you'd hear interchanged. And those are just predispositions that allow it to set up shop, you know, in the womb. And then
Mhm.
you have the issues present almost immediately when you're born. Okay, so that happened to me. And I kind of track through life, just dealing with little, my doctors were really good when I was young. So I only had to deal with small issues that would pop up here and there, and they would take care of them.
Mhm.
They knew what medicines to give and so on. And usually, surprisingly, it wasn't usually antifungals they would prescribe, though, which is a really strange thing to me. I've been dealing with the medical side of this whole thing for about 3 years now, pretty steady, and we run into that a lot. And we'll bring up, maybe we should look at fungi a little closer as related to these larger disease sets, and you'll have a conversation, or I'll have a conversation with these people where it's just rolling along and everything's yes, 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 and then you get to saying, well, maybe fungi are part of the issue, and it's just eyes glaze over. And it's not
Yeah.
because they don't know. This is in the data. You've seen what I've presented to you that we're
Yeah.
going to talk over here in a bit. It's there. You go and look at it, and you can find the pieces like the pattern thing. Look for the
Mhm.
patterns, which you hear a lot from some of the bigger names in phenomenology, and this psi research and everything else. Look for these patterns that are happening, and that's the
Mhm.
pattern that stuck with me. Is that
Yeah.
there's this trend towards these diseases being much broader. So what happened with my set is I got to about 45, 46 years old, and things started getting really catastrophic. I'd been dealing with a bunch of degenerative disease stuff for about 7 or 8 years, macular degen, meibum gland dysfunction, a bunch of issues with, overgrowth that I hadn't really caught on to yet. I could feel something was going off the wrong way, but again,
Yeah.
I hadn't dealt with such a huge push at that point until I landed at this doctor's office locally. It's actually a offshoot of Martin's Point up here, and the doctor that saw me recognized everything that I was dealing with as being related back to that original issue I had in out of the womb with the APES
Mhm.
at APS stuff. And she said, "Hey, we're going to give you a run of antifungals." Which I, again, going back to even before this, the doctors had not done, they hadn't really done that type of prescription for me at any point in my life. It was usually something to tamp down whatever was agitating or cooperating with the existing overgrowth I have just from the disease set. So they would give like antibacterials and things like that, antibiotics, I should say, and that would kind of tamp the issue down. but it didn't really remove the underpinning of the issue, if that makes sense. So it's like treating the symptom and
Yeah, yeah.
not pulling the plug on the cause. Same thing we run into a lot in medicine these days. So this doctor recognized, at Martin's point, what was going on, and she put me on 10 days of diflucan, fluconazole. It was just a small dosage once a day, and it started dropping things off my list of what was plaguing me at that point, just day by day.
Yeah.
Which I was like, it's really strange. I've been dealing with this stuff for over 40 years and had not had any of these turnarounds at the level I was having them. And I'm talking my meibum gland dysfunction almost overnight stopped bothering me. I had things like a congenital heart issue, a murmur that was really bad in upper left, just go away on the sixth or seventh night. And these are not things that you find being
Yeah.
referenced to taking an antifungal. And
Like
and
you're on a heart murmur doesn't just go away typically, right? I mean, that's like a
no, I
lifelong
mean,
condition
I'd had it
typically
since
with
I was born. Yeah,
yeah,
it plagued
yeah,
me since I was born. I had issues, trying to be active as a kid and teenager in high school and college and whatnot, and I just couldn't keep up. Even though I looked fit and carried fit, nothing really worked right.
yeah.
So that went away on the sixth day, and that's where my brain was like, wait a second, if this is taking stuff out from that far back that I've been plagued by my entire life, there's something to this, something really big to this. So I started picking through data. And my wife, because of the situation here at home, we both had a prescription that was fairly similar for antifungals. And again, I should specify here, antifungal drugs only target fungi. There are
Yeah.
some collateral effects that happen, but for the most part, anything that's being taken out by those drugs from the body is going to be related to fungi. So specifically, these azole drugs, like the fluconazole that I was on, that is just affecting the fungal ability to synthesize its own sterol to make its cell membrane grow. Like you and I, we use cholesterol to make our cell membranes and so forth,
Mhm.
and that's all handled by a processing, cytochrome processing that extends the cell membrane the way it needs to when we split cells and everything else. The fungi have a different sterol altogether. It's ergosterol. So ergot, those kind of things you hear in the fungal world. So ergosterol is what they use to make their cell membranes and extend their cells or their hyphae, for example. So azoles, these fluconazole type drugs, they only target that ergosterol
Okay.
process. It's real specific. So it turns it off, makes it so they can't extend their cell membranes or split anymore. Then you get into a real problem because you have a daughter cell inside a mother cell and it's not able to get out. And all of a sudden it's just blowing itself up, basically. Okay. So these symptoms and issues for me that I had my whole life were dropping off just due to that drug's activity.
Mhm.
And I called the doctor's office at the 10th day because I had been doing a bunch of reading already on what was happening because I was very aware of my body beforehand just from having to deal with maintenance and making sure I'm not getting sick or exposed to stuff to make me sick and all those issues. So I was real keyed into something big is happening here. I need to figure out what this is. And I looked at the charts that are out and available in public sphere, and it was saying that for my disease set, I should be on fluconazole for about 6 months straight
Wow.
at the stage I was at with the full I had a candida overgrowth. So candidiasis is the term you would hear.
Mhm.
Candidemia, actually, because they were like concerned about blood infection and everything else with me by the time I saw them. And for that to just go away is just, it's one of those things that it shouldn't really happen that way. So when I called them and I said, 6 months is what's showing on these charts out here for APES and APS patients like myself, they laughed basically. They were like, no, we're definitely not giving you 6 months of fluconazole. Sorry. You have to figure something out. If it comes back or whatever, it gets worse, come back and see us again. I'm like, okay,
Mm.
well, that's not going to work for me because I can feel
Yeah.
I'm still getting progress by
Yeah.
combating whatever these microbes are doing. So I started researching with a couple friends of mine that I've known for decades, and my wife too actually was helping at the time with a bunch of the early research. We started looking at what natural compounds were out there that would suit the same purpose. Yeah, it took a lot of digging and a lot of cross-checking and making sure that, hey, this isn't gonna, like this one isn't gonna offset what this one's doing, or it's not gonna interact or amplify something we don't want amplified. And kept picking through these pieces and landed with a very simple layout to kind of address it from our own personal perspective. And that
Yeah.
became, two or three compounds for what now is called, like the phases that we have in this work that I've done with everybody. So we had this first phase, and
Mhm.
that was three compounds is where we landed. And then the second phase where we figured out a couple of things that would kind of shore up what had been done under the hood by that first step and
Mhm.
kind of lock those things in. So we
Yeah.
kind of figured all these pieces out and started looking at them really heavily. And we started sharing them around online and with family members and so on and saying, hey, because you see a lot of these like, subreddits that are out there, or like, I jokingly call them parent blogs, where you would see like
Yeah.
somebody reporting, hey, this my kid had this and this is what worked, and it's real natural stuff usually, and kind of lower tone and lower key stuff. And I'm talking like phyto compounds, so plant-based compounds, amino acid things, like
Yeah.
N-acetylcysteine, for example, is a huge one. So we were putting this all together and sharing it, and I shared it with my parents. And they're in their 70s, and they were like, okay, we see what happened with you, because they raised me. Obviously, they dealt with all these issues when I was coming up and had to wear the braces for the first couple of years because of my legs and all this stuff. So they knew, and they could see all the changes that had happened with me. And they're
Yeah.
like, okay, we want to try this too. Because my dad figured, hey, you know what? I had some of these similar problems when I was born back in the 50s. Maybe it's going to help me.
Yeah.
So he jumped on and it did. So we started again, that my point there is that this is kind of like, it doesn't really matter where you're sitting in the age brackets. It seems like there's something under the hood that it still helps take out
Yeah. It can
with
benefit
this
you no matter.
approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. And as we were sharing this, because I started really focusing on, like you mentioned a moment ago, the genetic component of what's happening. I was like, well, why are these diseases or these pathogens able to do what they're doing in the body, to the degree that they are? And of course, you see a lot of the initial chemical issues that would come up. You see a panel, like a urine panel, that would show, hey, I've got mycotoxins and they're at this level, which is bad, and it's causing a bunch of other problems. And there's secondary metabolites that you can look at to see where you're sitting for how bad these are in your system. But the thing with this is that there was no real encapsulation for how quickly all this stuff was dropping. And I was thinking that the changes that were happening, because we got into like 6, 7, 8 months, and all of us that were long term on this, because we just kept going. Like, I'm a guy who, if I'm sharing this stuff out in the world, I'm going to be doing what I'm saying right
Yeah.
alongside you. Okay,
Yeah.
so I've been at this protocol about 3 years now, steady, and there's been just constant improvements
Yeah.
like the whole time. They're drastic up front, of course, and you can see that a lot in the groups that kind of hover around my topic. You'll see these reports that come forward, and I was sharing some of these reports with people and saying, "Hey, I think this is genetic. I
Yeah.
think this is the impact in the brain and on the body systems that are the key body systems. It all looks like it's getting like coded towards what we consider a genetic predisposition for other things."
Yeah. Yeah.
And sure enough, people started looking at it with us, and those numbers started clicking up. That, hey, here's another study. It does show that this is related. It shows that it's guanine, or some real simple polymorphism or mutation that's underlying this progression of disease.
Yeah.
And as soon as I started talking about the issues I was seeing with the damages in the hippocampus and some of the genetic issues there, someone on one of the forums, I want to say that it was, oh, I don't remember which one it is right now because we're running 3 or 4 when that guy was doing that part with me. But this person chimed in and they said, you should maybe look at what Gary Nolan has been doing,
Hmm.
because he's talking about a lot of the same areas of the brain you are, and the damages are sounding really similar. And again, I don't want to speak for anybody, but I'm referring on my own to Havana
Yeah.
syndrome, some of the issues you hear with experiencers, and like what's called hitchhiker syndrome, or
Yeah.
effect, I guess is a better
Yeah.
word. Those are what I see kind of being tied to this NHI side of things. So
Yeah.
this person turns me on to Gary's work, who I no offense to Gary, but I only knew him as the Atacama guy from
Yeah. Yeah.
the mummies. That's the only reason I knew
Yeah.
him. Had
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
idea what he was doing otherwise. Had no idea he was involved with all this absolutely incredible work with what he's done with cancer, and then these imaging things that he's come up with, which just boggles my mind even as much as I read this stuff. Um, so when I started looking, sure enough, everything I was looking at with, and this is in particular, everything I was looking at with Cryptococcus,
Mm.
um, it matched. It was almost
Yeah.
apples to apples for all the
Yeah.
damages. So we got this, like I said, this is about 6 months in, and we started this different track with our research, and started noticing that people were reporting a lot of changes with cognitive turnaround. And you can go and look at cryptococcus progressions in the brain with other immune compromised folks, and you
Hmm.
will see that the cognitive decline is almost always paired with their
Yeah.
disease progressions. And when you pull that deeper, it's usually cryptococcus behind the curtain.
Okay.
So it just started linking up, all these different syndromes that are related to cognition and issues there. I wouldn't say, memory issues that were turning around for people. all these different things that we started getting reports on for brain related, central nervous system related effects. And then people started reporting dream changes.
Mm.
So that was what really turned the switch for us onto the psi and phenomenon end, is that maybe if this is something that's pulling back a bunch of chemistry we need, that
Mm.
seems, and I don't want to say it seems directed, but it seems programmed. I will say that it's very much like, I don't like using the term virus in this world I research in, but it's kind of like a virus in any other system. You would think for, computers or whatever, it gets in there and starts doing its thing, and it's just on its own and running. You don't need to touch it after that. This
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
same idea. And you kind of hear that referenced a little bit by, Lou and Tom, and I guess sometimes Gary, but not as much. But you'll hear that reference of there's this control system
yeah,
that some group, if not, I don't think it's the totality, between you and me, I don't think it's the whole group, but a group of these NHI kind of set against us to, like you're saying, kind of steer our genetic progression, keep us maybe boggled, so
hmm,
we're not able to see the whole picture and put it all together. And if I were to boil it down to a quick term, I would say that this is like a biological aspect of what we have termed the great filter
yeah,
out there for why our species may or may not progress past a certain stage. I think this is part of what we're supposed to kind of figure out as a species is, literally what's plaguing us,
yeah,
get that out of the mix, and then that means you've kind of beat the system to a degree.
yeah,
You can see this story a lot, in um, some of the things that have happened in our group where these dream changes, I figured that was a major system that was getting messed with before people have gone on the protocol or anything that they've done for this kind of work to remove these pathogens. They didn't have their dream states like they used to when they were younger. And you hear that a lot too out in public. You'll hear that people as they age, they remember their dreams less or they don't dream at all. These things are kind of clamped and they get removed further and further and further, and I see that as an aspect of what these are doing in the brain. So when you remove them, some switch is flipped, and now people are reporting, dream changes. People consistently report that things like remote viewing, for example, is a big topic in some of our groups, and remote
yeah,
viewing capabilities and like perception level with that type of work go through the roof. And
yeah,
these are people who know their business. Actually, I should say it's both. It's people who really know their business with, remote viewing and those type of techniques. And then it's people who don't have any experience with that at all will come into the group, and we kind of show them a little bit about what's going on with that side of what we found out together.
hmm,
After 3 years, it's a pretty deep set of anecdotes. It doesn't really sit anecdote much anymore in my mind. And
yeah,
so we will work with that and kind of put people in a direction where, hey, is this happening for you too? And then we come back and check with everybody else, and it's matching apples to apples.
yeah,
We've landed in shared dream spaces. We've got one that is we call the lodge, which is just a term that one of the guys in the group gave it just off the cuff because we couldn't really figure out what to call it. And there's probably, I would say, a half dozen plus of us that have been there regularly. And one of them, even I hadn't met this person at all, and they had already been there and knew the floor plan. As
hmm,
odd as this sounds, they knew the floor plan that I already had drawn out.
yeah,
I drew a little map and I was like, hey, we have these shared dream spaces that happen as a result of protocol. I want to see what you think. And they're telling me about this dream that they had had where that's essentially what came out is that they had already been there. And it was even what they described for events were even similar to some events that I had happen in one of my I end up in lucid dream states a lot with
yeah,
this, which I know it kind of goes, some people have different takes on that, but I see it as valid as remote viewing and other things that are around that size circuit. So we end up with a lot of lucid dream states in our group, and I'd had a lucid dream there, and this person's events matched it, and they
yeah,
were just on the other side of where I was on that same series of events. They described it from their perspective. Everything was basically the same. So that kind of threw an even bigger flag along the way. Like maybe this is something where a system has been clamped,
hmm,
and the system I'm referring to in particular is it's dimethyltryptamine, the internal dimethyltryptamine system. So like our natural synthesis of that chemical.
yeah,
I have this whole really deeply researched theory that there's pathogenic interference with the base components that
hmm,
lead to us having that chemical available in our system, and that something with removing these is allowing your body to not have that interfered with as much. And now instead of deferring to bad chemistries or imbalanced chemistries with amines, you're ending
Mm-hmm.
up with a clear channel where your body is able to process these the way they need to. And then you end up with more of what I would see as the chemical related to these heavier dream states, these remote viewing states and all these things, which is that dimethyltryptamine that we make in our body. Again, this is not, it gets confusing there for some people too. I am not referring to, like say, some of the other experiments out there with tracking hyperspace, with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a lot
Yeah.
of those experiments that are happening in Japan. Those aren't really the track that we take in my group. We're more like clear everything off the table and
Mm-hmm.
let the body make its own level of what that is and what it
Yeah.
needs to be. So now you're in this whole thing where, you're seeing some of the control system aspects that Tom and Lou and Gary refer to on the genetic components. You have neurochemistry that's being messed with and leveraged. You have brain structures that are being damaged and lesioned, and they cause some real problems. I believe I've got something. Yeah, so if we go to, there's image 3
Mm-hmm.
that I have, where it shows, and this is specifically Cryptococcus that we've been talking about,
Okay.
where it bypasses the immune system very, very easily. A lot of people think that scenario we talked at the beginning, where you have a mother-daughter cell pops off, and that's as small as it gets for most people's understanding of yeast and how they progress their colony. That's not actually true. There's this even smaller component that's still bioactive. In
Mm-hmm.
this particular slide, it's referred to as a seed cell, but they're also referred to as an extracellular vesicle. So you'll see that interchangeably. But these seed cells are so small that they can pass that blood-brain barrier no problem. So this is showing a blood path to get there, okay, on that slide. And you
To
can
get into the
see that
brain, basically, and
into the
on the
brain, right?
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
So you breathe this one in. Cryptococcus is everywhere too. People really don't understand all the time that there's a real high prevalence of these in the environment around us all the time. Candida, Cryptococcus, Aspergillus, of course, is another one. Vegetation and stuff is that's really bad for that. So you inhale these, and they set up shop in your alveolar macrophages in the lung because they
Mhm.
get endocytosized and they kind of sit in there, and they start doing what they're doing because they're protected. So that's the other thing too, is even with a competent immune system, it causes enough issues with slipping the immune system first, so it's not detected, and then
Mhm.
secondarily, it starts like an autoimmune reaction with a couple components of its outer membrane. That's all it needs to do it too, by the way. There are other virulence factors, of course, but that starts the party. So it uses these slips and this reduction in size, this fractional sizing, to pass that barrier from the lung to the bloodstream and then right up to the brain. So that's one way that it happens. Another way that it happens is lung to vagus nerve to brain. So that's another huge nervous system component that does tap into lung, liver, all those areas are kind of attached to that. It's a major nerve system to our body, and it will
Yeah.
just, go through epithelial to endothelial, and then it's in the central nervous system, and now it can just party. So it really will
Mhm.
start, it just basically takes control of a lot of processes in the brain once it's set up there. And
Yeah.
this is showing one route to do that. You'll
And
see a
if
lot of, go ahead.
I was just going to say, effectively, well, we've had conversations before where it cuts you off from source. I mean, it seems like it's cutting you off from awareness of a perceptual side of what our capabilities that if we are thoroughly infected with this stuff our whole life, and what you say is true, then it's the instrument that's keeping us from realizing maybe our cosmic participation.
Yeah,
It's rather diabolical in a way.
I agree with that for sure. That's one of the things that it does land on for the end, kind of towards where these brain issues, these central nervous system issues all add up, and then you have that dimethyltryptamine issue behind it, which isn't just brain, it's not just central nervous system, like that's a much broader system than people realize, at least in my model. And I've put some pieces together that, not everyone agrees with, but I've researched them for, years now, pretty steady, where you can see these interferences that I talk about. One would be, okay, so you have a couple proteins expressed that are related to getting that amine chemistry in the right direction. I say right direction because you want to have it not interfered with
Hmm.
at the point where you take in this case, it would be tryptophan is where this all starts. So you end up with tryptophan. And when it comes in the body, it should be decarboxylated when you need to, it should decarboxylate over to tryptamine. And there's some pathogenic interference, and we hear, colloquially out there, you hear that 95% of our serotonin is produced by the gut, which is where a lot of these microbes start. So
Yeah.
Aspergillus is known, there's other things that are in the gut that would cause this issue. Pylori, H. pylori, which is not a fungus, but it does actually kind of partner with, I think it's Aspergillus that one partners with, if I remember. And one of the other researchers has a really good line on this stuff. But it's basically partnered with one of the fungi that's usually considered commensal. And just ubiquitous enough that it's in everybody's system to some degree. Like there's
Yeah.
an acceptable range of these mycotoxins in the human body. When you get a urine panel done, there's like an acceptable number, which is just alien to me. That you would accept that there should be any level of these pathogens that are strictly there to damage the host.
Yeah.
That's just not something that should be happening. So when you look at this tryptophan cycling, if you have pylori and this other partnership that's going on, it's attaching or basically metabolizing the tryptophan to be tryptophan hydroxylase. And when that happens, you're not going to see that move to tryptamine.
Yeah.
So because when tryptophan hydroxylase gets that decarboxylation I'm referring to, it actually ends up being serotonin.
Ah.
So when you compare these two stages, instead of just going from tryptophan to tryptamine, and then you would get this, there's this INMT is what it's called. It's another protein that helps with methylation. So it will double methylate that tryptamine, and that's where you get the DMT, dimethyltryptamine. So it's basically methylated twice to end up being our body's version of what it needs. On this other side with hydroxylase, and it ends up with serotonin, when that gets double methylated, which it does, that would show up as bufotenine. Should not be in the human body. Actually, I was just talking with somebody who's a 40-year MD, and I mentioned to them that, hey, there's this elevation of bufotenine that's showing in my model, and when I'm looking at for this whole idea of neurochemistry issues and control issues with this, and they had no idea that was happening at that level. They're like, well, you shouldn't do bufotenine or have bufotenine in the system because that's toxic to humans. Right, it is, because it comes from toads, some fungi, which is something that you should really throw a flag for everybody. Some fungi utilize it. So this bufotenine chemistry is getting made in the human body, not by the human, not by the host. So now you have this issue. And when you look at bufotenine, it used to be considered that like schizotypal issues and autism spectrum disorder, for example, were kind of leaning towards elevated dimethyltryptamine or DMT. And when they dug in more and did these urine panels, it turned out the elevation was actually bufotenine.
Wow.
For both of those larger issues they were looking at in the studies that I've seen. I think it was 15 or 16 out of 18 in this long-term study that showed that elevation. So, we're getting in this direction where you can see, again, control system wise and neurochemistry wise, there's a big issue there.
Yeah. And it's having an impact that is obvious if you know what to look for.
Right. And, another thing I think would factor in here too is that when you look at what, like say Dr. Gallimore has done out there with his dimethyltryptamine research, he is finding these, on these longer term doses of dimethyltryptamine that people can be in these states, and they connect to these. I believe his term that he uses is hyperspaces. And I don't want to quote him or misquote him, but those spaces are similar to what we're seeing on my end with those shared dream spaces and lucid states and so on. I would say that those are the same idea. It's just at a much lower level than what he's pushing to find the boundaries. I think he's more on that boundary end than I am, but we're still getting some of the same returns. So that connection to source, that cutoff from source, or whatever you want to consider the larger pieces of how our consciousness works. I think that's definitely one of the interferences that you find with these fungi in the body, particularly Cryptococcus.
Well, it's interesting. So basically, you're saying that the human body is capable of creating that kind of shared spiritual space with its own creation or its own amount of DMT in a healthy human, but that potentially we've all been hindered by the funguses here, so that we're not able to access or experience that kind of reality most of the time.
Right. Yeah,
Wow.
that's something I would definitely say is the boil down there, you know, and it's similar to the other issues that you see where it's kind of restricting a system to benefit the colony and whatever is like driving that colony behind the scenes. You know, and that's something if you want to segue to that, I think that would maybe be something that would be good to touch on here.
Yeah.
So when these colonies get set up, one of the major issues that you'll find, especially with Cryptococcus, is that like our own system, it has a charge, a cellular charge, so a negative cellular charge for Cryptococcus in particular. And it's actually what I've been able to find so far in the data that's available. Because I should also, I should explain this earlier, but I'm basically more on the line of being a review scientist. So I look at long scale review and try to put these pieces together in formats that others can understand easier and have a more complete model. So when I was looking this over and noticed that there's this charge, this negative charge to Cryptococcus, it kind of interferes and looks a lot like what we have for our own charge in the brain. You can see that there's something to these colonies as they extend. And I'm talking, you can look at just one singular Cryptococcus cell, and that alone has the highest negative charge of any pathogen I can find of its type. So now you put a colony of them together, and you've got essentially interference in the system, electrical interference in the system, aside from all the chemical interference, everything else we've talked about today, genetic interference. You have a literal shock charge, sort of, inside the brain, inside
Yeah.
our nervous system, that's interfering with your own processes and your own signaling, of course, and that progresses the disease further in their direction. All kinds of issues pop up, and now you're looking at something where that charge is going back to the idea of fungal consciousness for me in my model,
Yeah.
and it's, again, that's what they use for terms. I have some information on image 4 that's really worth looking at in this cryptococcal invasion issue. You can see to the right hand side on the bottom right and on the right hand side of the B1 slide, they're pointing out the cryptococcus cells that are in the hippocampus area.
Blue
And that's over
dots.
this is a 7-day progression, by the way.
Wow.
So that's all it took for this to get to that point. It was 7 days from initial infection through to these slides being taken. And you can see that there's Titan cells, which are that C1, that's a much larger cryptococcus cell in there. Titans are an issue because they have even larger capsule and even more charge, but they also have a bunch of active daughter cells they retain internally.
Interesting.
Which, yeah, and then that'll kind of bridge out, and they switch gears a lot to do different types of damages. And one of the damages that you'll see is if you look at image 5, I'm going to whip through a couple of these. This image, and it goes through a series of slides here. These are examples of damage that Cryptococcus has done in the caudate nucleus to an immune competent host. And you can see when you go and look at what you can get a hold of for, Havana related slides and things like that, some of the experience related stuff that you hear for, larger areas and smaller areas that have changed in the brain from experiencers. It kind of matches this almost exactly. Not just kind of, I'm saying kind of, but the damage is like the points of damage, the areas that are being damaged. It's all very much the same as what these other groups are looking at in the phenomenon.
Now, another interesting aspect of this, though, is the damage is exacerbated by radiation or crystallized by radiation, right? And as
Yeah.
we know, a lot of times people are encountering radiation as they're encountering physical manifestations of craft or whatever else. And so, to me, that implies the possibility of some relationship,
Yeah, you're making a good point. So with that part of the model, what's happening is the radiation aspect, and this is in a few different studies that you can find. One focuses a lot around Chernobyl,
Mhm.
and another place you'll see this mentioned sometimes is I believe the ISS had some issues with these fungi. It might have even been Cryptococcus in particular, I believe it was. And what happens when they get exposed to radiation, and this test was done, I believe, with a Saccharomyces species. I don't remember exactly which one. I can get that at some point. But with this experiment, they did this setup where they took the yeast cells and they left them at ambient, so like Earth ambient radiation, and then they took 2 other tests and they put one at extremely elevated radiation levels. I think like 880 millisieverts, like annual millisieverts exposure equivalent. And then they put another, so to the other side of the spectrum, the lower side of the spectrum, they essentially like Faraday caged these other yeast cells. So there's one that's ambient, one that's extremely elevated, and one that has no access to radiation, ionizing radiation at all.
Yeah.
And the ones that were in the median, so that standard ambient, they kind of went into torpor, like they kind of like pulled back their processes and went dormant, but they still stayed alive basically. Once they got resources available again,
Yeah.
that they pop right back to life. The ones that were in the Faraday cage setup, they completely died off. They
Wow.
didn't go into torpor. They didn't maintain themselves. They died off. So the ones that were on that other side of the spectrum, the overextended radiation exposure, their virulence went through the roof. So they went from being, somewhat in torpor to, they're just taking over the whole party at this point. So when that type of situation happens and it gets introduced to a host, which would be the scenario you and I are looking at for the seed cells to the brain and so on, that's
Yeah.
going to cause that same virulence increase inside the body. And that's known with Cryptococcus. When you look at Cryptococcus and its virulence factors in the body when it's attacking the host, one of the
Mhm.
ways it protects itself hardest is by melanizing. So melanization, so it will actually use that biofilm kind of setup to melanize and protect itself from, host issues with immune attacks and things like that that are, us trying to break its shell, so to speak. It's hard to do
Yeah.
to begin with, but it gets even more resistant, which we hear a lot with fungi. They become resistant to different things. This would cause that resistance to increase, but it
Okay.
also causes the virulence to increase. So that means that now that virulence being higher, it's going to be pulling resources from the host way, way, way faster, way faster. So when you're talking experiencers, so like you
Hmm.
made an example of a moment ago, I bounce back to Havana syndrome quite a bit,
Yeah.
which, I know people, that's a hot topic right now, so take it for what it's worth, but I see this as part of the mirrored issues with Cryptococcus, or at least these fungi in the brain. When you see radiation introduced, now that virulence increases. And what do we see in Havana? And what do we see with some experiencers, or like hitchhiker syndrome effect, for example? You'll see these damages to the brain kind of increase in certain areas. And it's not always the case. Sometimes, I know that there's changes to the brain that cause density changes and so on, for cell structures and everything in that area of the hippocampus. But there's usually a lot of damage that you can find when you go and look at reports. And this would be that damage. So it's like a two-part thing where you already have this existing colony or series of colonies in the body.
Mhm.
And now you have ionizing radiation that you're exposed to. And that virulence goes through the roof. And now you have the health failures and collapses that are usually related to those two other situations with Havana and experiencers. So it does kind of all pair up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uncomfortably, you know.
Uncomfortably so.
Yeah.
So,
I still want to kind of focus on this build of Cryptococcus in the brain, because I think that's the one that's really, if we're talking about the control system
yeah.
from a consciousness and like a, cognition issue side,
Yeah.
Cryptococcus is probably going to be the one that's really doing most of the damage. So we
Okay.
just talked about melanization
Hmm.
with Cryptococcus. Now, if you increase that virulence, or increase that melanization via ionizing radiation, one of the things that happens is that melanin being produced draws dopamine. It requires dopamine for them to be able to produce that melanin they use to resist and also increase their virulence. The thing that's
So
funny
they're
about
using our dopamine.
yes, and that's
So
the
is that
thing,
reducing our ability to, access dopamine as human beings?
right?
Wow.
That's exactly right, because they cannot synthesize their own.
Okay.
That's the thing with it. They like, it's not just that they want to use ours out of laziness. They literally don't have a way to access and make their own dopamine, so they do pull it directly from the host. And you could go, back to the medical end for a second. You could go on a further extension of that idea and look at, say, something like Parkinsonism, which is a dopamine related issue. And you could say, okay, well, now there's a little bit of a lead in here that we could maybe take a closer look at that kind of issue.
Yeah.
And you want to talk, okay, so, this is a kind of a crossover here between the biology side and the phenomenon legendary side. We're kind of billed by some people out there as a species that's born with amnesia.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, and if we're talking the whole model here, there's mycotoxins and issues in the amniotic fluid from that point on. This degradation is kind of happening. We should, and this is part of the model as well, where Cryptococcus fits in, we should have a genetic memory that's, in my opinion, would end up being familial to a degree without pathogenic interference. And this is known now. So there's this image 6
Okay.
shows this model of, again, cryptococcal infection in a specific set of neurons, which are the CA1 neurons, CA1 group. It does show up in like CA3 as well, but CA1 is where a lot of our memory building is done. We have specific processes that checkpoint and allow things to go in and allow our genome in those neurons to be altered and reflect a memory that's been coded in. It goes kind of
Okay.
triplicate, but that's all in that same group roughly.
Hmm.
And those CA1 neurons in this image 6 are actually being attacked by cryptococcus cells. That's where you see on the right-hand side of these images. That's all the hippocampal region. And you'll see
Okay.
these green highlighted sections in the red as well. And these are all part of that cryptococcus colony that's set up in those CA1 neurons. So you have this system where your body naturally builds memory, long-term memory, genetically in these CA1 neuron groups. And now, which is you also hear pyramidal cells a lot out there. That's part of
Yeah.
that CA1. That's primarily what that hippocampus area is made of or
Okay.
comprised of, is primarily our pyramidal cells. So these are getting damaged on purpose by our brain to make the memories. And now you have cryptococcus in there in the same region, damaging, you know, physically damaging the cells, causing lesioning, brain issues that way. Also, the genetic component, of course, is going to go along with, because lysing is lysing. It doesn't care where it goes, and it does
Yeah.
use the same pathway, which is these checkpoint pathways, toll-like receptors. There's one specific to memory building that cryptococcus also likes to use to access our hippocampus if it's not coming through that other blood-brain barrier way. So that's a real uncomfortable component too, where you're talking about our species with amnesia, born with amnesia. Now you have a physical reflection of that with this infection set.
Yeah.
So that I believe is something where if we look at it closer, some of the cognitive turnarounds that we see in the group and some of these turnarounds with, like you said, connection to source and so on, it's because some of these are in a state that's being repaired. And there are a lot of genetic repairs when the pathogens aren't present that can just kind of kick in.
Well, that's what I was going
Um,
to ask you. It's like if all these things have been causing damage for, our whole lives, and we suddenly remove them, what percentage of that natural ability do we gain back? Is there any, I mean, you probably don't know how to quantify that, but it's like,
well,
it's interesting to know what our natural capacities would be if these things are having the effect that you're talking about.
so a lot of the damage that you see is obviously it's going to tie into microtubule structures. That's a lot of where consciousness sits in my idea anyway. I jump off Orco-R a little bit for some of my theories, which is
Yeah.
pretty famous out there from Hammeroff and Penrose.
Yeah, yeah,
I kind
exactly.
of jump off some of that,
Okay.
where I see these structures, like these pyramidal cell structures that are responsible for, our memory building. And I didn't mention this yet, but also like our sensory and motor input from the external environment, when that gets coded to your cognitive map so that you and I are sitting here having a conversation we recognize as a conversation and so on, that's
Mhm.
happening in this same exact region.
Okay.
So when I talk about, potentially being like boggled by these type of infections from, even knowing really what we should be looking at or seeing,
Hmm.
that's an impact that happens there as well in that same area of the brain. So when you take these diseases out, um, the microtubule structures, for one, there's a lot of repair at genetic levels, but those microtubule structures are real important inside the cell for when things split or repair and everything else. There's things that keep our genetic repair systems going the right way. If
Hmm.
they're damaged by lysing and other things, those structures aren't there to hold things the right way and make sure all these error checks are happening. It's kind of like a process where when the DNA splits, and this is mitochondrial or nuclear, there's these pieces, these microtubule structures that kind of like a framework, like a lattice almost, that go up against it and kind of help keep it separate the right way and make sure everything goes smooth. If that's not there, issues, right? genetically
Yeah,
and everything
chaos.
else.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So you take the pathogens out that are doing that damage, and now those structures that make these checks, these error checks happen, should be more stable, not damaged.
Mhm.
There are ways for the brain to repair those too, which is kind of interesting. We'll get in that in a minute. But I see that it could be a lot of the damage being reversed. I mean, percentage wise, it'd be hard to put a number on,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I can say myself, just my own anecdote, that the level of memory that I've gotten back since I dropped these diseases and started pushing the buttons with these protocol compounds, um, the turnarounds, I can't even really tell you exactly how far they've come. But
Okay.
there are things that I'll be sitting there having, just a regular conversation, and I'll just one word will trigger this memory from like my, you know, fifth or sixth birthday for no reason that I had completely forgotten about. Now I have full recall of.
Yeah.
Just little stupid things like that. So I believe that just a lot of repairs happening, and it's not just in the brain, of course, because these pathogens are kind of doing things wholesale throughout the body, that do cause degradation and aging, so to speak. I think would be tied to this as well in some aspects.
And you
Um,
mentioned before, even some types of cancer could be related to this whole issue, right?
Yeah, I have a model out with some people on that. I put it up, the early part of it, I put up on Twitter late last year. Got a
Mhm.
bit of attention there. But these seed cells, like we talked about, Cryptococcus, other species that are known to be pathogenic to humans, they make those same idea cells, so seed cells, extracellular vesicles, and those go out from the main yeast cell, or when it's gotten in that mold state, that hyphal form, they'll pop off. I read the other day that the hyphenation on Candida albicans will actually put out thousands of extracellular vesicles per minute while it's extending its membrane. So it's like extending itself to make that mycelial growth happen. And these
Mm-hmm.
seed cell EVs are just popping off at thousands per minute. And those are bioactive as well. So when they contact like our cell membrane, for example, they have the same cellular component on their outside of their membrane that hits ours, and it just breezes right through like it does in any other larger form.
Yeah.
And these will have coding RNA. They will have the virulence factors included. There's a lot of expressions of different proteins that are related to virulence, that pop out in these EVs and can still do the same damage inside the cell, our cell.
Wow.
Now, some of those would kind of retune things inside the cell to flip switches. There are epigenetic taggings that happen because of
Mm-hmm.
what these little extracellular vesicles have in them. Like I was just tracking down a bunch of issues with that. So there, HDAC is one you'll hear for epigenetics usually, which is a histone acetylase issue, deacetylase, and that will show up and start doing similar to where it shows up anywhere else. It will start, tagging, so to speak, things epigenetically. So even if it's not a direct lesion, you can still see these changes happening. And it
Yeah.
seems like those changes are really steering our cells to be more of like a colony support for the fungal side,
Yeah.
because of how much that tuning has changed. And you look at cancer stuff, cancer cells, and you'll see that a lot of the processes that cancer is kind of pushing are kind of eerily similar, to fungal processes.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, and you can find these cases out there. I don't know if I included any in our initial conversations, but there are a lot of cases out there that you'll find where if you just administer an azole class, especially triazole, which is the more recent run of azole drugs, if you
Mm-hmm.
administer those compounds, you'll see tumors, like hard tumors and so on, disappear. And what's the explanation there? If, like we
Yeah.
talked earlier, the only thing it does is change the way that the fungi can
Yeah.
process sterols to make their cells grow and proliferate, if that's all that's changing,
Why
that
should
means
that
those
affect a
cells,
cancer cell?
yeah, so right, so they die
Yeah.
off, and now they're not driving that constant output of those EVs and so on to keep our cells tuned to assist that colony. So
Yeah.
now when that colony's gone, either your body can catch up
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
kind of see, oh, we got to take care of that. And that kind of starts happening a bit, or the tuning isn't happening anymore, and the cells can kind of clear that, and those tumors do go away. It's you can go out there and search those for case reports on PubMed, and
Yeah.
you'll find them left and right. If you put in, say Candida cancer azole, that's what
Yeah.
a PubMed search that we pull up quite a bit on my end, or Cryptococcus cancer azole, you'll see certain ones disappear that, like, I'm talking glioblastomas, extremely complicated cancers that they'll give like itraconazole or ketoconazole. Is it ketoconazole? Itraconazole is at least one of them for sure. I forget if keto is the other one, but they'll administer that particular compound, and
Mhm.
glioblastomas just shrink and kind
Wow.
of end up going away. And they
Yeah.
they do seem to stay, so there's not a recurrence either.
Hmm.
And you could even go another direction with that too. So you would have, say, a tumor excised, taken out, and radiation therapy, of course, is pretty common. So around tumors and whatnot, cancer in general, but you get radiation therapy, and say that there's a surgery and then radiation therapy to follow. One of the things that you see commonly pop up after that therapy that you have to watch for are fungal infection onsets.
Hmm.
So now, if you have that whole picture that you and I have put together,
Yeah.
you have the tumor that was being maintained by the colony, and they've got a handshake back and forth, and now you've taken that out, but left the colony behind, but you pumped it with a bunch of radiation
Which makes it more
along the
virulent
way.
and
Makes it
yeah.
more virulent, and now you've got that whole loop starting right over again. So you'll
Yeah.
see a lot of cases of cancer. Of course, we know that you'll have success to a degree with cancer treatment, and then things will recur 5, 6, 7 years down the line in some cases, sometimes quicker, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
happened within my family bracket, where I have these donated genes that ended up with my having APSID as a full presentation at birth. Obviously part of that came from my grandparents on one side, grandparents on the other side, if you track it back.
Mhm.
And that happened with my grandfather. Um, One side of the family, he had at 40, late 40s, early 50s, he had some significant issues: pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, intestinal cancer, and they did a bunch of surgeries and a bunch of treatments, and it went away for a significant number of years, like 7 or 8 years, and then just back. Yeah, and he was fighting the fungal infections. He was fighting the secondary stuff that I would say came along with the radiation therapy he had. Chemotherapy too, to some degree, is probably going to cause some virulence increases or changes, resistance changes for sure, on the
Yeah.
fungal side, if let alone the cancer side, but definitely the fungal side, because they get tuned to these things really quickly. So that whole point of it being something where you should really, I think, reframe the lens a bit on cancer and its progressions. I would say this is one of, not the whole bucket, of course, there's environmental stuff too, but
Yeah.
as far as pathogenic things, I would say this is going to be one of the major dominoes to tick, and
Yeah.
then see, not just see where it leads, but look at why that's happening. Look closer at why that's happening with these azole class drugs knocking cancers out so regularly.
Is this something that you see the medical community latching onto, or have they sort of remained blind to it? I mean, you mentioned
Um,
it's in PubMed and stuff, so obviously there's been correlations made, but
Yeah, they're aware. The
okay.
general medical community is aware. It's something where, unfortunately, fungal diseases got attached, and this is errantly, in my opinion, they got attached to being something that happens after you get certain types of care or certain types of immune compromised situations, and that's where the focus has been.
Yeah. So
Where
they're saying
I'm,
they're picking it up, like during the surgery or wherever else they're getting the
yeah.
seeded with the funguses, and that becomes the problem.
Right, right. So, and you'll see, okay, so a good example for the immune compromised side would be like, say, HIV.
Hmm.
A lot of progressions with HIV, and the immune deficiency that comes with, is that you see these fungal diseases pop up. I've lost a number of friends over the years to AIDS complications, and it's usually the complications turn out to be fungal. Candidiasis, cryptococcosis, all these ones we're talking about, aspergillosis, all these ones that we're talking about right now. So
Yeah.
it's this focus that we're all looking this way, thinking
Yeah.
it's immune compromised or post care on extremely complicated medical situations. And I say you got to look this way as well. Like, turn the whole thing upside down and say, could this be the original initiator? And if so, why aren't we tackling that? Where we have multiple case reports where I can think of one off the top of my head. This gentleman, I think he was a expat farmer that moved to Central America from up here in the States, and he was perfectly healthy when he moved down there. I don't think he was a smoker or anything like that, but he started farming in his region where he moved, He hadn't been a farmer before that. And all of a sudden he came down with what they thought was lung cancer out of nowhere. So he goes and gets checked, and they take a closer look, and it actually turned out to be a cryptococcoma in his lung that had set up shop and had taken presentation like a tumor. So they went and excised that cryptococcal mass, and boom, he was off running for however long. So again, there's even the symptom presentation gets mistaken
Similar.
as one thing,
Yeah.
but it's actually these fungi again. And that happens over and over and over. If you go out and look at these cases, you can look up immune competent stuff now. Post 2019, if you go and search like candidiasis or like candida and any other progressive disease in the body, you'll see this slope that happens where the research is, kind of here up until 2019, and then it just skyrockets for these fungal related things. And I believe that's going to track back to we were talking about SARS-CoV-2 earlier. It's getting more widely accepted now that SARS-CoV-2 causes immune deficiencies on the back end, similar to what I had with APSID. So it's like if you weren't born presenting the APSID, APS type issues, now you're most likely going to see that creeping in off the back of SARS-CoV-2 infection. It doesn't need to happen though that way. Just to go on this direction for a moment, there's with these seed cells, so they go through, and of course they can pass the blood-brain barrier like we're looking at in that slide from a little bit ago.
Yeah.
But when they do so, they actually can prompt in an immune competent host autoimmune disease to set in. Just the seed cells. That's all it takes. They have
Yeah.
this whole setup where they kind of leverage getting past the immune system, get in, and then they start the reactions that boost the output of our immune cells in a bad direction, and that's the autoimmune reaction state that you get.
Yeah. So you start
So
attacking your own body rather than,
yeah, right.
yikes.
And it's kind of at the behest of these little seed cells and these fungal cells that have managed to make their way past the barriers.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fascinating. One of the things I wanted to hammer on a little bit more so people get a sense of what you're thinking there is the idea of these colonies being conscious. What indications are leading you in that direction? And I mean, yeah, can you describe that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I really spend a lot of time looking at in the brain are the
Hmm.
way that these colonies are communicating, like inside the biofilms, what have you, the breeding colonies too for Cryptococcus. They have this very specific method of communication that kind of almost, I would say, almost matches our own processes, but not at a level that we can access those chemistries. So they have
Yeah.
their own charge, just like you'll look at some of these slides, and this is outside the brain, but they do the same thing in the brain. So this setup on the right-hand side of the image, you can see these little gaps that are in between these cells that are in this functional colony that's displayed at a broader scope on the left-hand slides.
Yeah.
And that is actually, if you look at it quick, it kind of almost looks like a synaptic gap
Yeah.
to a degree. And they are actually able to pass, messaging, quorum sensing, chemistry, their own chemistries, of course, back and forth across these gaps, cell to cell, and shared networks, resources, and everything else. So when you start looking at the idea of fungal consciousness, it applies here too, the same way
Hmm.
that it would for those structures under those trees out west that we were talking about. Um, going to image 8,
Okay.
there's a pretty healthy list that shows fungal abilities and how they relate to evidence that's given.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and, and and these are things that happen in these yeast colonies as well, especially once they get to that mycelial hyphal form that they take. So what I've proposed to some people, and I'm waiting to see who jumps on this first. I've had a lot of people knocking on the door, but no one's actually opened yet. So what I believe would kind of shore this up, besides what you can see in these obvious charts like that one from that image, there are certain signals that we can measure in the brain. So
Hmm.
I'll keep it easy, EEG, MEG, some of those, biophotonic imaging, those type of processes that we could image out
Yeah.
for, let's say, someone who is immune competent, but has never tried to like modulate their immune system or biome towards host benefit. So
Hmm.
they're fresh, fresh off the street, so to speak. They come in and you do a read of their brainwave patterns at that point.
Hmm.
And then, I'm not saying it would need to be the protocol I've laid out, but something in general to try and remove these colonies from the body.
Yeah.
Apply that, an experimental method, apply that to see
What the
once that
impact would
immune
be.
system is modulated, right? So what the
Yeah.
impact would be, and then take a second read, like
Mm.
say it's 2 months out down the line, and
Yeah.
you're getting markers from your analysis and other things that would show, okay, these markers for fungal issues have stepped down. Now take that initial measurement when they were fresh off the street and the second measurement that you've got under control, under experimental method, and you would look at the differential.
Mm.
So you subtract that second set of data from the first set of data, and what's left behind from that subtraction, that differential, is what I would say would reflect that non-human intelligence, that non-local, non-human consciousness
Yeah.
of sorts, like we're talking about with these fungal consciousness ideas that are getting floated around out there, is the same idea, but that would show you what that yeast colony or that fungal colony in the body was doing
Hmm.
at what we would consider consciousness in any other metric,
Yeah.
because it would still show you're still taking two EEG, MEG, those combined measurements, and you're
Hmm.
subtracting one from the other. So that's still going to be something that you could look at. And now, if you have that profile,
Hmm.
it's probably going to be a little different from like an initial wild type infection versus something that's already tuned to that individual person, or that host. But you can get at least a general read of what to look for. And I think that would may even be applicable completely outside the body, like in the
Yeah.
environment. You could even see that same type of signal because we've had that, we've heard that conversation before that there's EM changes that happen around entities or experiencers and things like that. Like they're doing a lot of that work out at Skinwalker with EM field changes and whatnot that they're monitoring.
Yeah.
So that would fit that same idea.
Yeah.
And that also this also kind of hits that hitchhiker effect button really hard because you hear those stories. I think maybe it was Jack Osborne went out to Skinwalker, and I
Yeah,
know there
no,
was
I
some.
saw the HBO, or I think had a series on where he was with a couple friends and he went to a bunch of places and
Yep.
Skinwalker was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and when he left Skinwalker, and I don't know, I haven't checked in because I don't really pay a lot of attention to that because I try to do as much of this research in a bubble as I
Yeah.
can to get my own conclusions. I like doing it that way and then checking it after I come to a conclusion, seeing what else other people have said. When I did that with this hitchhiker stuff, I landed on Skinwalker pretty quick.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that Jack Osborne thing, and I know that there's some back and forth here. I don't want to speak for anybody, but there were some reports that he had gone to Skinwalker and left, and he had some type of autoimmune reaction or some type of allergic reaction to something that he ran into at Skinwalker. And
Hmm.
I would say, going by what I can think of for Hitchhiker, being contagious between like family members or groups that interact with each other that have been at a site, start
Yeah.
having experiences that are maybe not wanted, and then other people that they meet, and that extends out to that whole hitchhiker just moves right along the chain. I would say that that's a pretty good example with what Jack supposedly ran into out there at Skinwalker, where he picked up a hitchhiker
Yeah.
and brought
No,
that with him. Yeah, go ahead.
well, an interesting thing about the hitchhiker thing is that it's usually seen in external manifestations, right? Like they'll see, sometimes people talk about seeing a dog man or an upright creature out in the yard or whatever, or poltergeist-like manifestations in their home. How does that relate to what the fungus is doing?
Well, that goes back to the hippocampus region that we were talking
Okay.
about a minute ago. So you get back
Yeah.
into where a lot of the damages are happening. And of course, you can look at the overall body systems,
Hmm.
outside the brain to see some of these damages. But in that section of the brain, we have our sensory and motor input control and also our memory building control. So if you're an NHI who's trying to hide, kind of stay, and what's that term that Gary and those guys use? The shadow biome,
Yeah.
I think is the term that they use, where something is just out of phase. So we have a real specific tuning for our
Hmm.
senses,
Okay.
and that what that tuning ends up being is that we have a way that we integrate the external data and
Yeah,
parse
sure.
it.
Talking
And
about
some of the
Gallimore again, we have a reality that we create, and that is very tuned to a specific kind of frequency. But there are things that are going on up below and above and all around that are outside of that
right, right,
frequency.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that I would say, the damages that I've seen and have tracked through the studies would explain having gaps in our perception that these
Okay.
NHI could slot themselves into. And then you get into scenarios like you're saying, like you might see a dog guy, or you might have an experience like in your bedroom, like I did at the beginning of all this stuff, where I had an entity show up 3 times in a row that I was very convinced immediately. I was immediately like, okay, this is just a brain trick. I'm playing this on myself. This is before we got the initial prescription I talked about at the beginning of the
Yeah.
show. And this entity shows up 3 times and asks me a question and asks me, do I want eternal life? And I'm like, oh, this is just coded from, exposure to religious stuff or whatever it might be. Um, so you have those scenarios that you'll hear from people. They have these interactions with an entity that is kind of there but not there. It feels like a dream, or they're put on hold or paused or whatever. And I feel like that's what's reflected with these damages Cryptococcus can do with its
Okay.
charge capability.
Yeah.
So it can alter basically by chemistry and by its own signal, its own charge, that interference in the system I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
That's something where that could be the answer to why those experiences are reported the way they are. It's not
Okay.
necessarily that it's not there, it's that it's usually tuned out.
Yeah.
And some people have more experiences than others, which we've heard that recently from Lou's work, where there are certain groups of people on the planet that seem to have a higher predisposition to having these experiences without doing extra work to have them, because you can work yourself there. I think everyone has the potential to be in this bucket and have these
Yeah.
experiences that occur, but there's some people that have that more naturally, and I think that's part of that, is where
Yeah.
these issues aren't always an issue for some groups. I would say that the ones that come out of Taffarel, a lot of the
Hmm.
damage there is something where that might predispose someone not just to the fungal infections, but having these experiences people report as well.
Hmm.
So now you have a scenario where your memory is being altered by something that's already set up in the brain.
Yeah.
The sensory and motor input stuff. So you hear a lot of like sleep paralysis type reports around some abductions and whatnot.
Yeah.
Same idea. If you're having issues with your motor integration to your cognitive map, you're just gonna feel like you're paralyzed, whatever it would be. A lot of those microtubule issues that kind of equate to anesthesia effect, that could be something that's happening there as well with those type of situations.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that they aren't there, because that's what you hear from some people, is like, oh, it's just a trick of the mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that's partially a trick of the mind, but there's something that we would not usually consider corporeal or physical that could be driving this from behind the scene.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a tie-in of it being an automatic system, like
Hmm.
we talk about, where it's in there doing what it normally does to set up shop, damage what it normally damages, and that kind of sets the stage for, if you need to directly control, say, that individual, now you can apply a bit of ionizing radiation if you're in one bracket of attack, or if you want to have implanted memories, like like the shield memories that people talk about when they have an
Yeah.
experience, and it's you're not remembering what was actually happening and so on. That could be explained that way as well, because
Yeah.
these things being in there, they damage that memory you're building as it's being built. In some
Yeah.
of these cases, it's so bad with the cognitive stuff. So yeah, I would say that that whole idea ties together, and the whatever would be driving from outside that control system is kind of what people are having slip through. You
Wow.
know, yeah,
Well, and if you think about like what foreign bodies or anything else have access to all of the systems of the human body in order to make those things appear the way they do, I mean, funguses are one of the only you know aliens that have access to all of the gearboxes or all the control panels. Through what you're
yeah,
describing, it's fascinating. And this list of uh, abilities from the different funguses, I mean, decision making, short-term memory, and learning, which is what you were just talking about.
hmm
And then the self versus non-self recognition, fighting behavior, trade behavior, manipulating other organisms, which is kind of what it's doing the whole time with the human
yeah,
body.
yeah,
That's scary stuff.
yeah. And again, this is something that it's getting more attention. If you look at image 9
Okay. Yeah.
and image 10, these are showing some pretty specific things that relate back to what I talked about earlier for the chemistry, the neurochemistry side of the control. So there's the green slides, where on slide A from that, those are healthy microglia. And microglia are kind of like the groundskeepers in the brain, so to speak. So they do a lot of cleanup and they do a lot of, messaging back and forth to make sure things are stable and where they need to be fixing things or whatever is happening there. If you look at B on that slide, that set of slides, the arrows are all pointing to cryptococcus cells that have made their way into the brain. And when they're up against microglia in that manner, you can see instead of the connections from slide A, all those connections on slide B are now shunted back. They're not
Yeah.
really in contact with each other. And that's called a reactive microglia or reactive state for those microglia. And when they're in that reactive state, one of the things they do is they start overexpressing monoamine oxidases. And when those monoamine oxidases are out in the system and they run into other parts of our neurochemistry, like say tryptamine is a good one, they actually oxidize that out. So it's not usable by the host anymore.
Yeah.
So like they don't, like Cryptococcus is so tuned that it's not even needing to do that activity itself to take advantage of that resource. It's making our own cells produce the chemistry that breaks that tryptamine down into something that Cryptococcus can then use. And it's also as a side benefit, it's affecting the host's availability to move that along that methylation path to what I state should be more prevalent in the body, dimethyltryptamine, natural dimethyltryptamine. And on that slide with the groupings around the capillary on the
Yeah.
left,
Yeah.
on the right, you can see these are all the invasion processes that Cryptococcus has in its bucket. So paracellular, transcellular, Trojan horse, it can get in all those different ways, and that causes reactive astrocytes. And astrocytes are very important to our brain's function. And now you have the situation where they're in there irritating those, putting them in a reactive state and causing similar issues to what we saw with microglia on the first slide in that set. So, this and this is something where, just to kind of segue over to what I think was left for clues on this, you can look, like I go to the Greek stuff quite a bit because I
Yeah. We
think
were
that's one
talking
of the
about
better.
the
Go ahead.
mythologies that you say confirm, and the explanations that you gave to me on some of these ancient stories are highly resonant with what your theory is.
We have this, all right, we have this story with Zeus off the Greek stuff where Prometheus decided that the way Zeus was treating mankind was ill. And he's one of the Titans, so the step above the gods of the Greek pantheon. And he's like, no, this isn't working. I've got to help somehow. I've got to help. So he does so. He decides to bring us the flame. And in my model, that flame is an archaic explanation for this dimethyltryptamine system, this soul spirit connection to source, like you've referenced a few times. That it's something where that's integral to that connection, to elevating us past where, in this scenario, Zeus had us, which is he's known as the gardener of men. So he kind of keeps us in a bracket, I should say, where we're doing things a certain way that fits his goals. Really, he's not really a great caretaker for mankind, even in the stories the Greeks wrote.
Yeah, where
So
he's using us.
he's using us, right,
Yeah.
exactly. So he's, some control aspect there, keeping us in whatever position he wants us to be, gardening us, basically.
Yeah.
So when Prometheus brings this down to us, this flame, he brings it to us in a fennel stalk. And that's a really interesting subnote because, again, the stuff I've done for work on the protocol is primarily based around phytocompounds, a lot of plant-based compounds. And this is one of the first notes that you'll see about this, is that fennel is extremely antifungal. It's one of, like, that whole genera, everything that's related to fennel is extremely antifungal, extremely antimicrobial, in a certain direction. It doesn't really harm things that would normally be beneficial to the human biome, but it really, really does a job on fungi and things that are kind of tied in those partnerships with fungi, like pylori I mentioned earlier. So he brings us the flame in this fennel stalk. And Zeus wakes up the next day or so, and he looks out across the world as he's taking care of things, making sure it's the way he wants it. And he sees these little flames lighting up everywhere. And he gets upset. And he figures out it was Prometheus that did it. So he changed Prometheus to a rock. Most people know this story. Changed him to the rock, and then there's this little tie-in there that I think reflects some of what we see now in medical information for the disease sets that I'm referring to with fungi, and that's that he was chained to the stone by his ankles. So you go back to, let's say, my example, because it's the best one I know from looking in the mirror every day. My ankles were literally twisted around the other direction, right? So that fits. And the liver thing with the bird eating his liver every day, and he's chained to the stone, and he always renews every morning, and his liver's brand new and starts the process over. That's also kind of tied to some of these damages that you'll see with these fungal pathogens in particular, like candidiasis of the liver is terrible, terrible stuff. Anyone that wants to can go check it out, but I'll forewarn you, it's pretty nasty. But that's that whole idea kind of showing up again. So now Zeus has done this to him, and that's bad enough, right? Zeus isn't satisfied. So he decides he wants to set one more stage here to make this even more of a get back against Prometheus for giving man the flame. And Prometheus has a brother, Epimetheus, and there's one forward, one backward is kind of the idea with those two. Okay. So Zeus gets all the gods together in Olympus and he says, hey, I hate Prometheus so much, I'm going to get his brother too, even though his brother didn't do anything at all. Okay. So they package every disease known at the time in this vessel, Pandora. And they situate everything. And Hermes actually brings her down. So Hermes is the one that delivers Pandora to Epimetheus as a bride. Prometheus catches on, and he's scrambling trying to get off the rock so he can get to Epimetheus in time to be like, don't take that bride, don't open that gift. It's going to be a problem, and he can't get there in time. So at Olympus, when they had put all this together with Pandora, they referred to her as a curse against men who eat bread. And what's in bread? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see where
Yeast.
this is kind of already leading, right? And there's one aspect that was in there that was positive, and I believe this is Hermes' fault, but I believe he helped tuck hope in that whole package of diseases. So Hermes tucked hope in there for mankind. And when Epimetheus gets his bride, opens the vessel, or she does, there's a couple different variations on the story. Hesiod's Works and Days is the one that I would defer to, but opens the jar, all the diseases come out and inflict mankind. And then the jar gets slammed shut at the last second. The only thing left under the lid is hope. And this is where it gets kind of interesting because you can kind of pull this back to current research and information. That hope aspect is really key to something that I don't think we've figured out the whole picture, but we're leading in the direction of, where if you look at meditation states or prayer states, things like that, they're kind of tied to an elevation in what's termed the spirit molecule.
Mm-hmm.
And that spirit molecule, most of us have figured this out by now, is DMT, is dimethyltryptamine. So there's some level of that increases when you are meditating or praying and really in that state. And what are meditation and prayer, in general terms? They're a form of hope, right? So you have this hope aspect that gets activated, and DMT is part of that loop. And when that gets elevated, sure, we talk about dream stuff and other psi related things with DMT, but there's a physical mechanistic action too that happens with DMT in the body. It actually triggers so many other receptors, or agonizes so many other receptors in the body that aren't just like serotonin related receptors or hallucinogenic type related receptors. And one of those receptors that activates is sigma class receptor, sigma 1.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this loop where when dimethyltryptamine agonizes sigma 1, it clamps those calcium issues I talked about a little bit ago at the membrane level for the cell that it's interacting with. So when that trips, now the calcium ion control is retained by the mitochondria and by the nuclear membranes, meaning the pathogens no longer have access.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how they do everything. That slide that we're talking about with fungal intelligence a moment ago, that slide mentions chemotropism.
Mm-hmm.
So that and galvanotropism is another one that's charge related. So galvanotropism would be the electrical charge that, because these things obviously they're one cell, they don't have eyes as we know it, but they're able to sense those things and move in the direction of where that resource is, kind of like the slime molds on the subway map, same deal.
Yeah.
So if you turn off that calcium leak, that calcium ion leak, because it has a charge that it's looking for and it has a chemical that it's looking for, now that hope that triggered your dimethyltryptamine release that then agonized that sigma 1 receptor has now potentially stopped some or stemmed some of the impacts of those diseases that are related.
Yeah.
So you have this whole thing, and that's all the way back to the legends, so that
Yeah.
is some of the oldest stuff that was written. You can go to there's other things that are in, larger scale religions. You'll find, okay, so I do want to touch on this real quick because we haven't gotten to it quite yet.
Yeah.
The protocol itself, with some of the main keys, are oregano oil for carvacrol. So that's the active component there. Now we know what that's
Yep.
doing compared to older times. Black seed oil, which is thymoquinone, that does a lot of protective stuff, antifungal, antimicrobial, beneficial to the person taking it, and the studies I've read across the board. And N-acetylcysteine, which is another one that breaks up a lot of biofilms, and it's essentially it comes from, or it can be found in onions, garlic, those kind of things. It's similar to that chemistry. So these are something that's in there, in these legends. Like you hear a lot about oregano stuff over the various religions and legends. That gets brought up as, like, I think holy basil is kind of related to that idea, those kind of things. And then you get to the second phase, the second step of that protocol that we developed, and you're talking resveratrol, which comes from red grapes, red wine in nature, sort of. So that's one that's in there. There's some niacin in there. Pomegranate is also in there, and you hear pomegranate all through the Greek stuff. Pomegranate's actually known as the bridge between the underworld and the overworld.
Hmm.
So that's how Persephone went back and forth with Hades
Yeah.
and everything else. So one of those things in the first phase, black seed oil, Nigella sativa, that's referenced in Islamic culture as something that will cure all diseases except for poisoning and so on. So that's known. That's in,
Yeah.
again, religion, legend crossovers are pretty close for most people, but that one
Yeah.
was specifically mentioned by Muhammad as being something that cures pretty much every ill out there.
Mhm.
So that's coded in. You get to that second phase, and of course, we're talking about a protocol that um, is, we don't really go hard on the diet side of it in my groups that I circle around, except for to kind of remove as many yeast-based products as possible. And it's not like avoiding gluten and things like that. It's just making sure the yeast itself is not a component of what you're taking in. And
Yeah.
that's whether it's active itself and can spread via colony, or even the fractional toxins that are left over. That's an issue. So you have this idea of being, for lack of a better way to say it, unleavened. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
And you think about resveratrol from that second phase. Now, resveratrol has a lot of, I know it's gone back and forth over the past few years recently, but resveratrol has a lot of notes related to anti-aging and antifungal stuff for sure. So if you look at that angle, now you've got resveratrol from red wine, and the major component we talked about earlier with that dimethyltryptamine loop was tryptophan. And one of the places you find tryptophan the most is fish, right? So now you have the scenario that's reflected in Christian theology, but it's coded. That's the thing, is this stuff got coded. Like most legends, it gets kind of filtered out and passed around and changed, whatever happens along the way that the writing happens the way it does. And the coding stuff, I think, kind of stays in there.
Yeah. Well,
And
that's an
if you,
interesting because it implies that there's a group of people or that have had knowledge of this throughout history in some form or another, or at least in the beginning they did, and kind of put these pieces in place for us to find a way to kind of fight it. Uh, what happened to those folks? Are they I mean, what is that? How does that happen?
well, I think,
Your
boy,
theory, obviously. I mean, that's a big
yeah,
question.
this is kind of, furthest reach on some of the theories that I've worked through, but I think that there are probably some, like everything else we hear about out in the world these days, there's probably opposing structures.
Yeah.
There's structures that want to keep this set
In
up with
place.
these infections and so on, and the degradation of our genome and so on going in a certain direction. I
Hmm.
have some theories on that, which would be the control system may not be just a simple, changing your neurochemistry and giving you some damage in your central nervous system. It may be something where later on that may allow for a more deep integration of the external part of these NHI non-local consciousness setups to
Yeah.
integrate to the body, to integrate to
Yeah.
the host. I wouldn't want to say possession, but pretty darn close.
It's something along those
Um,
lines. Yeah.
Yeah, something along those lines. It's been termed different things over the years. You know what I mean? It's got a lot of different stories. You hear of like APEP and those things in Egypt, and you hear of like Tuatha Dé and the Fomorians. The Fomorians were all kind of racked up, in my opinion, with this set of diseases because they were known as cave dwellers.
Mm-hmm.
And then they came out of the caves and they were running Ireland, and that set of stories, that set of legends. And that's how Tuatha kind of fought against them. And the Tuatha had this healer that was really well known for knowing all the plants that would fix every problem in the world, every illness that you could come across. So I think that there's this side that has kind of kept quiet to a degree, but kept these things seated. And that goes back all the way before we were even writing, in my opinion, James. This is verbal record stuff that made its way through to Greek stories, other stories. We're talking that whole peninsula you and I looked at the beginning of the show. That whole area is rife with the oldest writing forms that we can find. Like
Yeah.
the Despilio tablet, I think, is one of the oldest. And if you start looking at the Despilio tablet, that's got old writing that mimics um, Tifnog script, which is from Tafaralt, Morocco region. It also closely mimics some of the Greek stuff that grew out of that set of alphabets, but no one's decoded those yet. But what I'm getting at here is I think that goes way, way back for some of
Yeah.
this knowledge getting passed along. You hear shaman references a lot in my work on the psi and phenomenon side, even in the medical community I deal with, because they deal with areas that are not represented as well budget wise and so on. So they have to refer to what shamanic knowledge is out there for the plants in the region that can cure certain diseases. So the same thing is kind of known. I think there's like a core group that I don't know if it's really input that I would say, but get steered in a direction and kind of these things happen, where
Yeah.
the information comes to somebody, like the guy who I think went on a dimethyltryptamine run. And during his dimethyltryptamine run, he saw this serpent showing him something. And the serpent was showing him benzene rings. So that's how benzene was even discovered, was this guy had
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
interaction with something. He took as kind of an experience or whatnot, and he ended up coming out of that dimethyltryptamine run, which is exogenous, of course, is not the natural version I'm talking about, but still that produced a similar result. He
Yeah.
he tapped into something, and that, going back to what I was saying a moment ago with this, these sides that are kind of opposed to stuff. When you look at what I gave for an example with the unleavening and the red wine and the fish, we get
Mhm.
back into that New Testament stuff, which I do, kind of refer to just out of habit from the way I was raised, but it actually
Yeah.
fits parts of the model as well, because, eat this bread it is as my body. What was his body? Unleavened, right?
Yeah.
So, and now you've got, what was he known for passing around for a liquid? Red wine, right? Drink the wine.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so now you've got resveratrol in the system, so that's knocking down pathogens and fungi in particular. And then you have this last thing that was kind of known in that era, where fish always came up a lot in the New Testament. Eat the fish. It's always fish and unleavened bread and red wine. And fish is where you find tryptophan in nature, the
Yeah.
easiest. So now you have this, lack of yeast in the body, and this old 2,000-year-old version of this, how to do this thing on the medical, the physical side of it. You've got this unleavened situation in the body where you're not taking in yeast. You've got resveratrol from the red wine, and then you've got tryptophan available because you're eating fish a lot.
Yeah.
So now you're bridging that gap, and you're back in this idea of, oh wait, maybe this is that dimethyltryptamine loop that my group has kind of fallen into, but it was the 2,000-year-old version taught by him in that
Yeah.
particular setting. But again, you can find these over and over, these different stories of compounds that help something extend life, or Gilgamesh is another good one. He
Mhm.
was kind of known in his story for going around trying to find all the plants and things that would extend life and make him stronger and grow him to a man of great stature. That whole idea. In fact, the way that he ended up going out was that he went and talked to the Mesopotamian equivalent to Noah. I forget the guy's name now. It's just kind of a longer name. I'd never pronounced
Yeah.
it correctly anyway. But
It's an E. It starts with an E, I think. But
Utparshnam or something like that, as UT, I think at the beginning. It was like a couple names that are interchangeable with the Mesopotamian and Akkadian side. But he
right.
goes to this guy and says, "How did you get your eternal life? What did you
Hmm.
do?" And he's like, "Well, I did it here, but that's like 300 feet underwater now." Going back to what I said about the sea level rise, you see what I mean? And that would kind of fit that whole idea.
Yeah.
So he said, well, there's this plant that can do it, but the plant that can do it is now submerged. So Gilgamesh goes out, he ties a bunch of stones to his feet, and he goes to the bottom of the water. And he gets this plant that this Noah equivalent told him to go and get to finish his mission of becoming, godlike or whatever, immortal basically, because he was on a real search after Enkidu kicked it. So he gets the plant, and all of a sudden something gets in his head. And this is something I want to touch on for the protocol stuff in a second here. Something gets in his head kind of, and like puts this doubt in there, even though he knew to go ask this guy, how did you do your thing?
Mhm.
He goes and finds it, and he starts to not trust it. He's like, he's just trying to kill me. He doesn't, I don't trust this dude. So he finds the closest human, and he's like, here's this plant, see what it does. Basically, that's how the story
Hmm.
works out. So he gives
Yeah,
it
yeah,
away, and it's the last one. And it doesn't kill the guy, but then there's just not any more of it. So he lost his mission because he got this semblance of mistrust. And it's interesting, going back to the psi component and some of the interactions people have when they start this protocol. I had it happen. My wife had it happen. I've got, dozens into probably hundreds of reports from people in the group over the past 3 years that have filtered in and out of an interaction that we have, like a encounter sort of thing, but it's usually in a lucid dream setting where you
hmm
either run into like a version of yourself that mimics you very closely, but it's kind of messed up physically somehow,
yeah,
um, like a dirty, kind of slimed up, gross version of yourself, or you run into literally this black goo slime in these dreams that people report. My instance, which I've talked about a bit online, but I'll refresh. It's basically where I ran into a version of myself in a very isolated space that
hmm
kind of came up on me really quick and started kind of doing the weird thing where, you get those movie scenes where something's like talking real close to the person it's like, negging them really hard,
yeah,
so really negative energy thing. And it came
yeah,
up to me and it kept saying, if you keep pursuing this, you're going to die. Like pursuing cleaning myself out of this. So you're going
yeah,
to die. I have this, because I have some cancer complications. I have this lipoma that's related to lymphoma progressions. It's on the back of my neck here. And it kept indicating that specifically. And it said, if you keep messing with that, that's definitely going to kill you. I just kept saying this, and I got sick of it, and I, basically removed this thing from the equation in a manner I don't want to explain. But in this dream, I removed it from the equation and
yeah,
woke up out of that lucid dream immediately, and I felt like 100 times better. It was
hmm,
like I literally broke a link of some kind,
yeah,
and that's been reported. Like I say, by my wife had the slime thing show up. She had a version of herself that was like mine, that kind of gave her some real negative attitude, and then she sat on this couch and got pulled down into another lucid dream inside her lucid dream by this slime that she ran into, and that's been reported by a lot of people too. And they push
yeah,
back on it, and when they get past that hitch, psychologically or whatever's happening there, they get past that hitch. Some people in the group have taken it to be a literal link that's being broken between that non-local,
yeah, yeah,
non-human intelligence in the body. That link is getting broken, and that's what it's
mhm,
trying to do, is push you to fear to not do that. So that kind
yeah,
of thing with that Gilgamesh story is reflected in what I've seen in modern day from my own work in this protocol group. So one legend I do want to finish up with, on
sure,
the legendary stuff that's really interesting. It kind of, people have their own takes on this stuff, obviously, but I study some of the Nordic legends, related to how they achieved, I don't know, godhood wouldn't really be the word, but their eternal life stuff and everything else that they deal with. And a lot of that's consciousness based, like the Rainbow Bridge idea and all those things like that, and bouncing around here to there. We hear a lot of those things, a phenomenon now, that it's like more consciousness and mind driven than, say, maybe just a hardware UFO
yeah,
UAP. Like
absolutely,
the body is the spaceship in a lot of these channeled works. I don't really know them by heart or anything. I've heard them from other people. But this
yeah,
whole idea got me latched onto something that's in our modern pantheon of medicine and disease, that related to a story about Odin. So Odin, he had this guy that hung around in his area named Mimir, and Mimir had a cauldron that was always boiling, the well. You've heard that phrase, get well soon, or hope you're doing well. That well is really related to this idea of these old wells, these old cauldrons that societies back then would have, that just kind of boiled things and put things in a soup, and you would take that in, and that would kind of help you with diseases or whatever in the area that you're in, which makes
yeah,
sense. If you think about basic medicine, that would be a good way to do it.
yeah. You
So
inoculate yourself sort of by
it's
taking. I mean,
inoculation, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's everything goes in there. So it's plants and body stuff and everything that kind of would encapsulate the diseases in the area. So that's what Mir's been doing for God knows how long under this tree.
hmm
So Odin starts bugging him, And he's like, give me a drink of your well. I want to see what you're about. Like, I want to see how you got to enlightenment and everything else. And Mimir just keeps shutting him down. He's like, no, no, nope, nope. And finally, he relents because Odin's just like that, always knocking on the door. And Mimir says, okay, look, dude, like, go hang yourself on the tree for 9 days over there. Put yourself up, do the thing you got to do. So Odin's like, sure, sure, okay, I'll do that, no problem. I'm ready. So he goes up, spends the 9 days in this story. And that's not where he gains enlightenment. A lot of people miss this gap. That's not when he gained enlightenment. That was the first step of this whole thing. So he's up there on a 9 day fast. And if you go out and check, a lot of the candida groups and things like that, that's one of the recommendations you'll see out there for combating these fungal diseases inside the body as you go on a fast for an extended fast. And some people like that technique. I'm not big on it myself, but they'll use that to kind of leverage against these diseases and push them back because you can out survive a colony made up of a bunch of single cells that are just kind of cooperating. You're going to out survive that, so they're going to run out of resources before you do. And that's part of the scenario being on the tree for 9 days. So it's a dry fast, no water, no food, nothing. He's just hanging for 9 days. And then he comes down off the tree and he goes to Mimir. He's like, hey, I did the thing. And Mimir's like, good. Okay. Take your eye out and throw it in the well. That's your price for enlightenment. So at this point, it was 9 days already for this fast. Odin's like, sure, out it comes into the well. Now, after that, Odin takes, Mimir's satisfied. So he gives Odin Gjallarhorn, full of this well juice, and Odin shoots the whole thing in one shot. And next thing you know, he is flying that rainbow bridge, dude. But here's the thing. The tree was a yew tree. Okay, some people, it's mistakenly translated as an ash, which is similar, but it's a yew tree when you get into some of the more precise, in my opinion, translations of this work. So it's a yew tree, and that means that those yew leaves and needles and other stuff around is in this well, and that's all boiling away. And when you look at the eye thing, and because really what it came down to when Mimir asked for his eye, he said, what ails you or is keeping you from enlightenment lies behind your eye. That's why it had to come out. So now it's in the well. But if you look at more recent data on these type of infections, and Cryptococcus causes this kind of stuff all the time. Like my wife had some issues with eye complications due to some cryptococcal exposure when she was like 1 year old or so. And it caused some changes in her eye pattern. So one turned strabismus wise in amblyopia and that stuff. So it's there in the data that that's an orbital infection, fungal orbital infection around the fat pads in the eye and such. And that's why it gets extended and moves things around where they shouldn't be. And that's what, in this model that I work with on this story, that's what was behind Odin's eye, is this fungal infection or cancer, whatever it had progressed to. And then he drinks this yew drink, right? So you go and you look at yew tree in modern era for medicine, and there's this related compounds that come from the yew tree called taxol and taxane. And those compounds are actually the most antifungal compounds known to man. The yew tree is so antifungal just by nature that only one fungi can grow on a live yew tree, period, as chicken of the wood. That is it. There's no mold, there's no other fungi, there's no mycelial growth underneath them. That is it. And when you look at what they've done with this taxol taxane compound that causes that to happen, to not have fungi growing on it, that is now used in modern medicine as a drug called, well, it's several of them, but the one that most people know is paclitaxel, which is, again, it's one of the most antifungal compounds in the medical bucket, and it's also one of the strongest anti-cancer compounds for chemotherapy. It stops, it's a cell cycle arrestor, so it keeps the cancer cell from being able to do what it does to overdo itself and just keep proliferating these bad cells. It shuts that down. And that came from the yew tree that Mimir's well was under when Odin drank his shot out of Gjallarhorn and then gained enlightenment. So there are a lot of these, do these things and it'll lead you to enlightenment that show up over and over and over, like pomegranate that we touched on for half a second. Same idea. She would take pomegranate to bridge that life to death cycle. And because of the Greek stuff, you look at what Zeus did to begin with his brothers and sisters and the Titanomachy and everything else, where they had fought each other, and then he won and got his brothers and sisters back from Kronos. Now, what is Kronos known as? Time, Father Time, time itself. I would extend that to the medical side, say that that's a representation of time in the body, to a degree because of the way that story worked out. When Zeus won, he went to Kronos and he kicked him in the stomach 7 times and got his brothers and sisters back in the reverse order that they were eaten because Zeus was trying to avoid that prophecy of him getting taken down by one of his offspring. But
Yeah.
that's the whole thing of he was reversing time somehow. He'd figured out a way to reverse time for his brothers and sisters that had already been taken out by
Yeah.
that Titan idea, that idea of time itself. So you can see these reflections of this fungal disease and disease progression in general, that control system, going back to a very archaic point in our history, verbal
Yeah.
and written. And that's something that I come across a lot or come up against a lot in the phenomenon stuff and UAP stuff, is that a lot of people think that I'm saying this is the answer to all of it.
Yeah,
And
and that's an important point you want to make, that that is not the end all be all of what everyone is seeing and is manifesting, but it may well be a portion of it, or at least how we interface with some of it, right? I mean,
yeah. I think it would be the restrictive component that you hear a lot from people, where they're like, there's some aspect that's kind of holding us back. And I think that there's a spectrum for these NHI in general, which is kind of reflected in that story of Hermes leaving hope under the lid because he
yeah,
still, gave enough of a care about mankind to be like, they still need an out, dude. That's kind of his take. And you can kind of see that a little bit. But yeah, this would be that aspect of the one that's kind of set against us as a challenge, if you want to
yeah,
say it that way, that great filter idea that I said this would be the biological aspect of it. To me, we exceed a boundary, in my opinion, we exceed any boundary that's related to that great filter, and it's probably going to get us past it. We
yeah.
have to figure out one of those buckets. There's this old video that I had seen when I was I want to say in college, maybe. So maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, of this shaman who was explaining, and I believe he was from South America. He was explaining why we haven't been invited to the big party, like the galactic level party that they kind of refer to in their pantheons. And it was basically we hadn't figured out disease yet.
Yeah.
We're still sick. We still have something that they can't interact with, or that's holding us back from being able to interact with them. And this shaman specifically referenced it as illness. Illness in the body is the thing that keeps them from being able to be around and do things that we should be able to do. Those higher, I don't want to say elevated states, but that's kind of where it lands. And you hear that a lot too. Like there's this change in the vibration that's going around and so on. That conversation comes up a lot in our circle,
Yeah.
where it seems like mankind is like bridging up. We're just at that bump where if we get past that bump, that's going to open up a lot of doors. I think that's part of disclosure, honestly, that they're kind of keeping tucked a bit at the moment, is it's not going to end up being all just the nuts and bolts stuff.
And in a lot of ways, circumstantially, you've had this theory confirmed by some of the reactions that you've gotten from folks, right? I mean, like there has been, like, it's not like you're speaking into a void. There have been responses that you've gotten.
Hmm.
And I don't know how much of those you can talk about, but there has been some reaction that has been indicating that maybe you're onto something.
Yeah, okay, so I don't want to speak for anybody here, but I was so just playing this safe. I was approached by someone that everybody in phenomenology knows. I'll put it that way. They know this initial contact that I had, and they were reaching out at the behest of one of the other researchers that we've been talking about today. And I don't quite want to say who, because I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
where that all stands at the moment. But I was approached to detail my version of the control system and what it relates to, how it's affecting humans. It was also kind of directed towards the idea of controlling a craft as well, which we can tap on in a second. So I wrote this 5-6 page letter and sent it off to the gentleman who had approached me first. And he came back the next day and he said, okay, um, the doctor who's asking about this wants to see citations. He wants you to cite this. Can you go one level deeper? Is how it was said. So I did overnight. I gave like 65, 70 citations attached to this letter and just sent it back off. And it started a series of conversations. So I've been sharing a lot of information and data with this group on the psi end, the phenomenon side, and that extended into another large group that is specific to mold care and remediation in the body. to a degree, and they were looking strictly for exogenous sources of this, like toxins that are out in the environment that are affecting us negatively and so on. I'm like, no, wait, you guys need, if you're doing this, and you're doing this at the scale you're doing it at, you should be aware that these set up inside the body as well. They're already there. You don't need to worry about the environmental stuff as much as you need to worry about what's happening in our system. So I've had a few reach outs on that. I'm working through a lot of details because it is a big model. That's the
Sure.
thing, as you've picked up on.
Massive.
It's yeah. There's a lot of pieces, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
So luckily, I'm getting bridged in now with more exposure. Like doing your show, and more people are reaching out from that original circle and saying,
Mhm.
hey, you know what? I do understand what you're saying here. Can you explain this part more? So now I'm getting these very specific splinters of the theory in the hands of people that some of these people are 30, 40-year MDs that I'm dealing with who are like, yeah, we've been suspecting this. We know that we rot and we rust, but we weren't really sure entirely like what was causing the whole package. But what
Yeah.
you've put in front of me now is indicating that, yeah, this is most likely the rot and the rust that we tag aging as. So, and the control system thing, it's got a few different facets for me. One is that there's the clamping that we've been talking about, which keeps us from certain things. And I would say some of that stuff is very much related to consciousness, parts of what would be considered psionics that we haven't really tapped into as a species for a long time. I think that those were something we had at one point and got eroded by these, curses against men who eat bread. So you
Yeah.
can go back to the old verbal record and the old initial Greek stories of all these gods, these demigods, and they had these abilities that were just over the top. You look at Hercules, you look at Perseus, you look at all these really interesting stories from the Greeks, and they were noted as a demigod, so son of Zeus or whoever it might be, and they have these abilities that they can run that we don't have access to anymore. But I'm seeing that might be something because I've had conversations about atavism and resurgent traits that may come up just by the lines crossing enough that comes back up. But I think that may be something that we have access to even without waiting for the atavism to happen. So
Gotcha.
atavism would be exactly that. It's recurrent. It's like resurgence or recurrence of vestigial traits that had been kind of taken out along the way by what has been termed as evolution and so on, but I think it's more pathogen
Manipulation.
and yeah, it's like pathogen and environment driven for those changes. So you get to a point where that control system goes away, so now the clamps are gone, and there's some experiments out there that you can find, and I've mentioned these a few times where they can measure our EM field, so your consciousness, representation for data. You can see that 63 centimeters from the body, so about 2 feet. And that's in a system that, again, still has the clamps on, is still damaged, still tamped down, doesn't have its full extension of capability. And then if you take that out, it's like any other electrical system. Interference is going to cause the original system to not work at its full potential. It's the same thing. We're an electrical system. If you
Yeah.
have something that's causing interference, now that's tamped back down. Now it's gone. And that 63 centimeters could be the size of the room, the size of your house, the size of your town. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one thing that needs some, again, that's part of the verification stuff that I'm working on with some of these people. Um, but with the craft thing, where I think this comes into play, is a lot of what we see on our consciousness, mapping is related to activity down to microtubule stages, right? And the interaction of that EM field with the microtubules. There's a bunch of stuff that happens with EM field to mitochondria, and biophoton output towards the microtubules and damaged cells. You can kind of find these studies out there where that is like a repair setup where it causes coherence changes.
Mhm.
So decoherence, recoherence changes in that microtubule structure by this biophotonic, really, really low power too, by the way. It's not like you're going to see it on a, with your naked eye, but these little packets of photonic activity between the mitochondria and these microtubule structures. And that's decohering and recohering, so it's coming back kind of in a more stable state, is the way I would
Mhm.
say that. So
Okay.
when you get to the point where that idea of your microtubules and that reflection of your consciousness and the activity happening, you could take that to the idea of, say, a craft if it were biology based versus nuts and bolts like we think on common terms. And you've heard that before. I'm sure that some of these seem like they're biological and not so much like a
Oh yeah,
actual like
absolutely.
bolted together structure. So if that's a system of microtubules, which anything biological has,
Hmm.
and you have the right output from your consciousness to match whatever that mapping of those microtubules are, now you're controlling that craft. That's the far,
Interesting.
far end of the theory,
Yeah.
which is one of the questions I got actually from this other group that I'm talking about. That I think was kind of what they were really after at the
Hmm.
onset, was asking about, hey, we want to hear more about your control system. What's
Yeah.
your idea with this control system?
Yeah.
And I think it's going to, some of that might prove out for some of the craft. It's not going to be everything. I think more like Tic Tac sphere kind of organic looking stuff versus like say a TR craft that
Yeah.
people talk about these days. That's definitely something probably constructed by something somewhere, but who knows what. But these
Yeah.
craft, you could look at that as a biological form that's integrated, can be integrated to by a consciousness, by the
Yeah.
EM field of a body.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Which is
so
something experiencers often describe. I mean, that whole experience of being brought on board and given control of a craft, but doing it through their consciousness rather than having, engines or,
yeah, yeah,
that sort of thing.
it's like a whole different, and they talk about this too, where they're able to access a different level of physics than we can.
Hmm.
And it wouldn't take a lot to be able to extend that to something where you're looking at a gray that's really just some, you know, puppet essentially. Not all
Yeah.
of them, but some of them are very much just that. We've had some conversations on the far end of the theory where, they themselves might be a long-term result of these fungal infections over like, thousands to tens of thousands to however long number of years. That's something, impossible to determine that part, but they have these certain characteristics. You hear a lot about grays. There's supposed changes to brain structure and volume, like they are kind of lacking lots of the major parts that we would have above that hippocampal basic region. Um, they have a certain smell. They have like a biofilm over them that is kind of like seems like a protective thing. And you hear stories about it damaging people that touch them and that sort of thing. Um, One thing that sticks out to me is the ammonia smell, right?
Yeah.
So you have this ammonia smell, and you're like, okay, ammonia, you think, okay, what else does that in biology? Well, you think cats, something like that. Cat waste is pretty ammonia laden. We have some processes in our body that are in the disease sets that I'm talking about that cause ammonia elevations.
Hmm.
Okay. So when you look at Cryptococcus, it's really interesting. One of the things that Cryptococcus has is called urease, and that's one of its primary virulence factors in the body. And the reason it's a primary virulence factor is that Cryptococcus can actually use uric acid from the body as a resource by tapping with urease. But one of the off chemicals from that interaction between uric acid and urease is ammonia.
Wow.
Uh-huh. So if you're chock full of this particular pathogen and you're overrun with this cryptococcal infection for generations and generations, far longer than what we've been, because again, it comes from the caves. That these things kind of settle down in cave systems in the water. That's where these yeast come from. We get a lot of cross kingdom infections because of things coming out of caves. So if these are already in there, living underground, which is another thing you'll hear in phenomenon chatter a lot, there's something
Absolutely.
underground. So they're exposed to this constantly.
Hmm.
Whatever is driving this whole process, they're exposed to it all the time. So that very well could explain that smell, the idea of them being like kind of, smaller and altered versions of us maybe, or something else that was on the planet before us, like a predecessor species that was non-sapien or not considered a sapien.
Yeah.
So those type of things fit. There are other things like the angel hair phenomenon, right, which comes up in Lou's book. The
Yeah.
implants too. The implants, honestly, I would say those are probably something related to fungi.
Yeah.
Not the
But
ones you
what
see that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the angel hair thing. What's the connection
So
there?
So the angel hair thing shows up around sightings, right?
Mhm.
So we know
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
and you hear a couple stories out there about when analysis has happened. But one of the stories that I have caught on to a few times, and these are for surviving samples, because they'll pick up the sample of it and test tube it and just
Mhm.
put it away, and it doesn't degrade, really, which some of these structures from these fungi would be able to do that. if they were constructed out of certain resources that were available at the moment that it was constructed. Okay. So
Yeah.
when you look at them, they look like hyphal structures. These hyphenated structures I'm talking about from fungi, they look
Yeah.
roughly the same. So what I would propose there, and we hear a lot of chatter about almost instantaneous construction of some UAPs by these NHIs. So if you have something that's biology based, like we're talking about, but it's a craft, you
Mhm.
could, if you had the right access to physics, and I'm talking probably like, I don't know, say something like neutrino level power output versus, like a regular fission reaction we deal with. You could drive that towards cellular processes and do something like the 3D printing that's been done recently with
Mhm.
microbes.
Yeah.
You could speed that up down at like, cytoskeletal expression levels to make that just balloon. But here's the thing, it's going to take so much power to do that that it's going to have residual ionizing radiation. And what happens when you get exposed to a craft, James?
Yeah. Exactly
Right,
that.
extra ionizing radiation. So that would be, to me, the angel hair thing would be kind of like if you think about a 3D print that happens these days and you have the sprue that's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the actual print that you're wanting,
Yeah.
that gets
Yeah.
left behind. So they could be popping off this ballooned craft really quick with this massive jolt of power, and that's the part that takes off and we see zipping through the sky at Mach whatever. But the left behinds, the sprue from that 3D print in this example, would be the angel hair stuff that's falling and getting collected.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, even outside of this whole model, that makes a lot of sense. Like, um, as a leftover of the manufacturing or materialization process.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And there's that
So
whole thing. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say I've got to wrap it up pretty soon. But I wanted to the protocol itself. If people want to try it, and I'll let people know I'm doing it. So I'm on board with giving this thing a shot, and I've been doing it for about a week. My wife's been doing it for about 10 days.
Mhm.
She has irritable bowel syndrome, and it's been feeling funky the last week or so, off and on, and she's been having issues with it sounds like a die-off, according to what I've read on some of your forums and whatnot. But I mean, how do people get more involved or learn more about the protocol? How would you recommend them getting that information?
Well, we have, okay, so there is a subreddit.
Mhm.
Um, Now this goes to the other side because when we started this whole project, some of the guys that were helping with this, they came up with what they thought would be a good catch-all. And they
Mhm.
called, to encapsulate everything in an easily digestible manner, they called the group that we study of all these different species cosmic death fungus.
Okay.
Which before we finish up completely, I want to go on that tangent for a moment. But with this
Sure.
cosmic death fungus group, that's on Reddit. So
Okay.
that's just the subreddit that is out there. There is a kind of a live group on Telegram. I know not everyone uses that app, so that's fine. I mean, my own account on Twitter X is at S Peribsen, all one word, and I have a lot of stuff on there about it. And
Okay.
if you search my profile for the NAC protocol, is what it would usually come up as. That's where
Okay.
you would usually find that.
Okay, and I'll
So
link to all that in the description of the video so that
perfect.
people can get ready. And there's also the document, the cosmic death fungus document, which is like I don't know how many pages, but it's not that long of a read, and it lays out at least the basics of the theory and then also the protocol in terms of dosages and whatnot. But
Right.
the one thing I wanted to point out here is, I mean, if I were to come into this and not having talked to Seth and done some of my own research to sort of vet these ideas, I'd be worried that there's some catch, that there's like a way that you're trying to make money, because but there's not. There's really not. Like you go
No.
through what he's advising and the diet that he or the materials that he's proposing. There's no brand name he's suggesting. There's no product behind any of this. It's like basically suggesting that you try these different ingredients in order to rid yourself of funguses, but none of it is going into his pocket. There's no expenditure associated with it besides buying the fairly cheap materials. So you can rest assured that this is not a scam to get people to spend money. I think it's coming from a much better place than that.
Yeah, you're making a good point there. I have purposefully not taken any pay from
Yeah.
anyone.
as you mentioned to me
through the
before,
3 years. Yeah, you and I talked privately about that a bit, but it's something that it feels like for me, I have just done the work to try and pinpoint issues. I'm not out here to get my own name on things.
Mhm.
Any professional papers I do are published differently than what you guys would know me as. So that's a whole separate bucket.
Mhm.
There's no income on my end for this at all, and that's, like I say, by purpose. I've took my savings that I had at the time that this all started, and I've just used that, to get through the research, and now it's starting to get more notice. So honestly, I usually try and help people find the lowest, also the best quality versions of these things as they ask. And again, I'm sure I'll get inundated off this, but my DMs are open.
Yeah.
I'm one of those guys that I don't put my stuff behind some wall where you can't see what I'm doing. I'm
Mhm.
very open. I'm very out with everything I've put together and everything I'm presenting for theories. If there's a gap and it gets illustrated to me as a gap, I will
Mhm.
help try and figure out why that gap exists and fill in the blanks on it so it's not a gap anymore for the entire knowledge base. And that's what we've been doing. We basically, I'm attached to an institute overseas, a private
Mhm.
institute, as a permanent fellow. And that group, our whole goal with my work was to end up with an open research group
Mhm.
that could kind of approach academia from a different angle, very democratic, trying to get papers through a white paper stage, then to a pre-peer, to a blind peer, to getting printed and DOI'd. So that's
Mhm.
one of the goals I have, and that's all been free. I've been running that idea in the back end this whole time, and it's kind of what the Telegram group has really ended up being.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
there's and lots of people there, and they're all throwing ideas at. They all get, I mean, they get taken seriously, they get exchanged, they get worked through. It's really impressive to watch the level of engagement from all these different folks, all trying to work toward the same kind of realizations.
yeah, and
Um,
that's
uh,
and that's an interesting. That's the thing too, is it does happen. People that don't even realize they've had any predisposition or any type of fungal diseases like this along the way.
mhm.
Now they're like, wait a second, that's something that plagued me since I was a kid, and now
Yeah.
it's gone.
Hmm.
And then that clicks for them, and they're like, okay, this is something to this, and they start telling their friends and family. So now it's just kind of growing organically into this thing where there's enough checks and balances initially, even though it's not officially peered or blind peered on the type of review I'm doing. It's pre-peered to, like, ad nauseum. I mean, I have clinicians, decade-long clinicians that are looking at this. I have PhD neurovirologists that are looking at this stuff with me. Large money guy type groups that are looking at it with me to see where the value is, and there's not value yet, so that's why no one's paying me. But anyway, so that's this whole thing that we've really strove to do. Is we felt in the core group, we felt like this would maybe take weight off larger systems that were extremely burdened post COVID-19.
Hmm.
And it was an accident that we landed in that bucket of thought. But that's what we came to for a long conclusion, is that, hey, if we can all figure out how to modulate our immune system and biome with these simple compounds that are over the counter
Yeah.
and at a low sustained level, which is the saturation element that you and I have talked about. And basically what that means is that it's a low bioload, but because of the extended time frames at that lower bioload, it's letting the body adjust to not having those pathogens in the
Hmm.
body. We've
Yeah.
seen labs, just for a quick example on that, we've seen labs that were somebody fresh with no protocol, like I talked about earlier, and then
Hmm.
a 2 month into the first phase, and their mycotoxin profile cut by 50 to 70%.
Wow.
Right. And that's by the numbers. These are, and you can get these tests. There are non-lab order groups that will do this out there. Can I name drop a company? Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
mine. I have no connection to these guys at all.
Yeah. And
But
that's for a
life,
test to see what your levels are.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So Life Extension offers
Okay.
a urinalysis for mycotoxin profiles,
Okay.
and that is body and environment both, so you can see what's going on there. But that's what a lot of people run,
Mhm.
is that set of tests, and you can kind of check that yourself. Before, if you're in the middle of protocol, you can still look at it now and then check it a month or two
Chart it
later and see
later.
what's
Yeah.
happening. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So one thing I did want to finish up with, because everyone loves this question, is the panspermia angle that
Yeah.
you
And that's
kind of brought
exactly.
up.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So with the cosmic death fungus thing, that came into view because of some issues that we saw around large bolides coming in very odd timings compared to some outbreaks that shouldn't have happened. And one that stands out in particular is Vancouver, 1998. You can go out and find these articles, but there's an article about these 3 fireballs that came in. I believe they came in, and I have to double check this, but I believe they came in counterpoint to the actual meteor shower. So the meteor shower was coming in one way, and these fireballs came in counterpoint, like a different angle that shouldn't have really been happening. It was 3 of them. And that was in 1998, I believe late 1998. And then by mid 99, Vancouver had the largest outbreak of Cryptococcus gaudiae that I have confined anywhere as a concurrent outbreak. And again, it's in an area, a region that really shouldn't have that level of outbreak with Cryptococcus. Even someone bringing it back on a plane or something like that wouldn't account for it. So that's always been this kind of odd link that stuck out to us. And we started tracking this further and looking at areas where large bolides had gone over, like Chelyabinsk, for example. And although that was not quite as clear with an outbreak, what does get pretty clear is if you start checking the birth rates around the same time that large bolides crash near like a waterway or a water system in these larger areas, you can see a dip, this really odd dip that shows up pretty frequently around these sites where things have hit a waterway that would fuel an area. And that area then sees a little bit of a birth rate dip for a couple, 3 years after. And then it picks back up, but you can see that trend keeps coming up. And what we thought about here is, okay, so we've got extremophiles, right? And that's basically what these are. These types of these species of yeast, they're able to survive in the human body, an extremely harsh environment internally. It's bad. It's bad. It's way worse than just living outside the body. So we basically have extremophiles that have set up shop inside the human system.
Yeah.
And if you think about where extremophiles are also sometimes projected to exist, it would be out in the cosmos, at least in the system. Right. And like Paul Stamets, for example, he's kind of roughly mentioned that we should expect to find fungi of some sort on almost every planet in the system, if not every. So there's this event that happened around Saturn. And we know Saturn is kind of attached to a lot of phenomenon stuff, and that's Chronos again. So that idea of time physically. So about 100 million years ago or so, the rings show up. Those weren't always there around Saturn. I believe it was about 100 million years ago they show up and kind of being projected as when they came into existence. And that would have been from something. Some people say it would be a larger moon, like planetary sized moon, that got pulled apart. And that's going to be a violent reaction. I mean, it caused the rings to exist. So you can imagine how much other dust and detritus that was larger got flung away. And we're constantly in this spiraling pattern through the galaxy, trailing the sun in this big corkscrew. So every once in a while, we come across this path of Saturn's dust trail.
Right? Well, the wash.
The wash. And if you look at the timing of when the dinosaurs got taken out, say 66 million years ago or so, just rough numbers, something drastic happened. And everyone writes it off as this huge meteor. And might have taken 40 million years to get here or whatever, but this huge meteor that crashed into our surface and wiped out the dinosaurs. But it's not the way people usually think. When they started digging into this more, they found that it was due to Aspergillus related infections in the throat. They found this brontosaurus, I believe, skeleton that had a bunch of damage to the inside of the vertebrae of the neck, and they were like, "Oh, it must have been a predator." And they went back and looked at it again later, and they're like, "No, this is aspergillosis." The same aspergillosis that I've been talking about, online and with you. The same thing. And that was 66 million years ago, and it just wiped everything flat. So that's that panspermia angle kind of playing itself out again. And so it brought, I believe, classes of fungi, or at least yeast mold type fungi, that may not have been here originally. So the panspermia angle sits, and you can look at that in that modern day example with that 1998 to 1999 Vancouver situation being very similar.
That is absolutely fascinating. There are so many avenues for further research and possibilities in how this ties in with all kinds of aspects of the phenomenon and just regular biological origination. I mean, like, people talk about panspermia being how DNA seeded this planet in the first place, because there's a lot of people who say that the complexity of DNA required a lot more time than the time that we've had evolutionarily on Earth to develop, because the the coincidences that would have been necessary for that stuff to line up the way it does and the work the way it does are mathematically impossible unless it had a lot more time. So, I
Right.
mean, that could be how the fungus got here. That could be how we all got here ultimately. I mean, and maybe this is just another aspect of that. But fascinating conversation, man. This has
Yeah.
been brilliant. I appreciate you and thanks for talking with us. And yeah, no, amazing. You've
Yeah.
done
Thanks
great
for having
work.
me. Yeah. Well, it's like I say, it's open, so it's going to
Yeah,
progress.
yeah,
We'll have to revisit this in a year or who knows, but
yeah,
yeah, again, if people want to reach out, don't hesitate. We've got the Reddit group, we've got the Telegram group, and my profile is very easy to find. So
yeah.
thanks,
All
James.
right. Yeah, no problem. Thank you, man.